An excellent evening from Japan. Good morning to all the guests joining from Europe. Good afternoon to all the individuals taking part from different parts of Asia. A very warm welcome to everyone. We welcome you all to the International Symposium on Mainstreaming Quality of Life and Evaluation of Transport and Spatial Planning. We want to inform you and take your permission to record this session. We will later broadcast it on our website. These are the instructions for all the panelists and attendees for the interpretation feature. Please select from the bottom panel which language for interpretation you would like, English or Japanese. I would recommend you to please stay on one channel. If you would like to hear the interpreted language only, then click on mute original audio. We request all the participants to keep their microphone on mute during presentations and panel discussion. These are the instructions for all the speakers and panelists. We recommend selecting gallery view for an enhanced experience and to see all the panelists. You can raise your hand if you want to discuss something directly with the host. Also, please keep your video on when you speak, and do not forget to unmute yourself when participating in discussions. Click the green share screen button at the bottom of your window when you want to share your screen. You can use the standard Zoom chat to comment. You can also comment or answer using the Q&A button. These are the Zoom instructions for all the registered attendees. There is no audio or video for the attendees when panelists speak. However, you can chat with the host or the panelists if needed. You can also raise your hand during the open Q&A time if you want to ask or comment a question. You can type in question using the Q&A feature. If you are having any problem using, if you are having any issue in your internet, you can join this webinar using the following information in the chat box. I'll skip this slide in the interest of time. You can find more information about our past activities in the chat box. Now let's go over the agenda. We'll open the symposium with a welcome remarks by President Chubu University, Professor Takeuchi, followed by opening remarks by Dean Sonobe, followed by introduction of symposium by Professor Hayashi. Then we have the session 1 on historical changes and alternate approaches to project evaluation in Europe and Japan, chaired by Professor Hayashi. This session contains presentations by Professor Wickerman, Professor Rottengetter, Professor Crozet, and Dr. Yao. Each of the presentation is followed by a small Q&A session, and after that we have a coffee break. In the session 2 on quality of life accessibility approach, it is chaired by Professor Zhang. It contains presentation by Professor Hayashi, Professor Dr. Takeshita, Dr. Morita, and Professor Kachi, followed by comments by Mr. Leather. The third and the final session, session 3, project evaluation in post-COVID-19 era. This session is coordinated by Dr. Sitaram, and it has 2 rounds of panel discussion, followed by the closing remarks by Professor Rottengetter. Let us now begin our session. I would now welcome President of Chubu University, Professor Yoshimi Takeuchi, to give the welcome remarks. Over to you, Professor Takeuchi.
Thank you. My name is Yoshimi Takeuchi, President of Chubu University. Good morning and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to make a welcome speech. This is a little in Japanese. 皆様、中部大学アジア開発銀行研究所共同国際シンポジウム国土と交通と土地利用計画における QOL の主流化にようこそご参加くださいました。このシンポジウムは中部大学持続発展スマートシティ国際研究センターが数年にわたってアジア開発銀行研究所、世界交通学会とともに実施してきました世界のスマート交通、高速鉄道とクオリティオブライフに関するシンポジウムシリーズの一環であります。今回は同センターの林義嗣センター長を代表とする大学民間コンサルタントチームが 国土交通省から研究助成を得た道路政策の質の向上に資する技術研究開発プログラム、QOL に基づく道路事業評価手法の開発 SDGs への貢献評価の研究開発プログラムの成果を中心に展開いたします。講演には、当研究チームの欧州現地ヒアリングを受けていただいた世界を代表する交通学の研究者の方々をお招きしています。1972年に交通プロジェクト事業評価がイギリスで導入されてから半世紀が経過し、社会変化とともに改定されてきた評価内容とその背後にある理論をお話しいただきます。その皆さんは世界交通学会元会長のドイツカールスウェイ工科大学のローテンガッタ名誉教授、国際学会誌トランスポートポリシー元編集長のイギリスケント大学ビッカーマン名誉教授、世界交通学会元事務局長のフランス・リヨン第二大学コロゼ名誉教授の方々です。また日本からは、交通事業評価実務の中枢、国土交通省道路局の八尾国際室長が、当研究チームメンバーとともに講演をいたします。また、途上国の専門家であるアジア開発銀行交通部門チーフのレザー氏と世界交通学会 COVID-19 タスクフォース共同議長の広島大学張教授にもスピーチとコメントをいただきます。中部大学は13年前から国連大学認定のユネスコ ESD、持続発展のための教育のリージョナルセンター、飯吉敦夫先生代表ですけども、ここにおきまして、中部日本地域における ESD と SDGs の啓発、普及活動を行っています。また、2019年には、ローマクラブ日本、林義嗣先生が代表ですけども、メインキャンパス内に設置されまして、地球規模課題に関する国際連携を深めています。2020年には、さらに2つの組織、国連本部の ESDs 部の直属の国連地域開発センター、UNCRD と企業の SDGs 活動を支援する中部 SDGs 推進センターが加わりまして、中部圏 SDGs 広域プラットフォーム、これも飯吉敦夫先生が会長ですけれども、これを結成し、SDGs 活動を展開しています。研究面では、カーボンニュートラル2050に資する超電導直流送電、革新的治療に関するペプチド研究、低酸素コロナと交通研究など世界拠点として活動しております。本学の研究教育がこのような活動を通して圧力の高まる世界において人々のウェルビーイングのためにお役に立ちたいと願っております。本シンポジウムのテーマ、交通と土地利用計画における QOL の主流化はまさにその中の重要テーマであり、本日の議論から世界に発信する新しいパラダイムが見出されることを記念いたしまして、私の挨拶といたします。どうもありがとうございました。
Thank you, Professor Takeuchi.
Welcome.
Let me now welcome the Dean of ADB Institute, Professor Sonobe, to give the opening remarks. Over to you, Dean Sonobe.
Thank you, Deepansh. Following up President Takeuchi's welcome speech, I'd like to provide some opening remarks on behalf of the Asian Development Bank Institute. I would like to express our gratitude to Professor Roger Bickerman for his kind participation as the first speaker of the first session, which will start very soon. From England, where it is in the early morning, and all the other speakers and panelists, including Professor Rosengatter, Professor Crozet, Mr. Yao, Dr. Kachi, Dr. Takeshita, Dr. Morita, Professor Jan, and Mr. Leder, who will be discussing experiences and lessons learned on project evaluation in Europe and Japan, and the new research on the quality of life method and its applicability. A special thanks goes to Chancellor Iyoshi and President Takeuchi of Chubu University for the kind support they have offered to this event, and to Professor Hayashi and my colleague Dr. Sitaram for chairing the symposium. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge our supporting bodies, namely the Japanese Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Tourism, World Conference on Transport Research Society, Special Interest Group A4 and F3, the Japanese Association of the Club of Rome, and the Tube Region SDGs platform. This event is a continuation of a long-lasting relationship between ADB Institute and Chubu University. We have collaborated for many years on many highly successful projects about quality of life, such as an international conference on transport infrastructure development, spillover effects, and quality of life, a handbook on high-speed rail and quality of life, and an upcoming edited volume on the frontiers of high-speed rail. We are delighted that we can continue and expand our collaboration, building upon our past work, despite the travel restrictions and other difficulties due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, policymakers across the world, especially developed part of the world, are talking about green recovery and green development. And accordingly, private sectors are keen about the challenge and opportunity that green recovery and development will bring about. From the developing world point of view, however, green recovery and development are relevant only if they are compatible with the more fundamental and urgent development goals, such as poverty reduction, food security, healthy lives, and water and sanitation. Poorer rural populations are concentrated on remote and less favorable land with poorer agricultural productivity. Due to unsustainable farming practices and inappropriate agricultural technology, more than 50% of land used for agriculture is moderately or severely degraded, and every year 24 billion tons of fertile soil are lost due to soil erosion. If this remains unchecked, almost 95% of the land would be degraded, thereby posing a serious challenge to the food production system. Whereas the global population is projected to increase from 7.7 billion today to about 10 billion, and consumption of agricultural products is estimated to expand by approximately 70% by 2050. Once food supply shortage happens, these most vulnerable people will suffer the brunt of the negative impact first. It is thus obvious that much more productive farming practices and technologies must be adapted, and circular economy must be adapted even in the remotest areas. And for that purpose, high-quality managerial human resources must be involved massively in rural development. This means that there must be some urbanization even in remotest rural areas, and hence transportation connecting such areas and large cities are definitely important and necessary. Turning to large cities, rapid urban sprawls from large cities to rural sites have forced poorer urban people to face with severe living conditions without access to safe drinking water, hygiene, or artery road. Improving this situation requires the massive deployment of human quality resources in city planning and management. In saving the developing world, I think an essential role will have to be played by the planning, building, operating, and maintaining transport infrastructure based on the quality of life methodology. I hope we will have very fruitful discussion today. I stop here and conclude my remarks by welcoming all of you once again. Thank you for your attention. Deepansh, over to you.
Thank you, Dean Sonabe. I will now invite Professor Hayashi, distinguished Professor Chubu University and chair of the symposium, to briefly introduce the symposium to the audience. Over to you, Professor Hayashi.
2人のウェルカムスピーチどうもありがとうございました。このシンポジウムは、実は長く、私自身も待ち望んでたものであります。今日このコストベネフィットアナリシス、これはロジャー・ビッカマン先生から後で紹介あると思いますが、1970年代の初めにイギリス政府が、道路を作るときにはそれがもたらす便益とそれに対するコスト、社会全体のコストが、便益とコストが釣り合うかどうかということを検討しないと、このプロジェクトを認めませんという、こういうシステムを作られたわけですね。それをずっと遡っていくと、イーブ・クローゼスさんの母校でもある、フランスのグランズエコールのポンゼ小生の先生をやってたデュプイが開発したセオリーがあるということで、そしてそれに対してローテンガタ先生がその社会的なインパクト、マーケットに乗らないインパクトっていうものを重視する、それをどういうふうに算定したらいいかと、こういうことをやられてきて、実はこの3人の先生たちは世界を代表するこの交通プロジェクトとその評価の先生であります。先ほどご紹介ありましたように、世界交通学会での皆さん要職を占められているわけです。で、今日はオーディエンスとして、この研究者の皆さん、これ日本、世界いろんなところからすでに今30カ国ぐらいから出ていただいているらしいんですが、この研究者と、それから、特に日本の方は行政の国、それから地方自治体の実務の方々にも加わっていただいております。で、今日のテーマは、50年も前に作られたシステムでありますので、当時は時間を節約すると、それを車を運転してるんではなくて、工場で働いたりオフィスで働くと、その企業がこれだけもっと稼ぐことができたんじゃないか。それはひいては国の GDP を上げると、これによって評価するということだったんですが、ただ現在においては、今日の議論の中心ですけれども、例えば私は70歳になっちゃったんですが、元クラスメートっていうのは働いてない人が多いんで、時間を節約してもそれを工場で働いてたりすることはなくて、むしろそれを余暇に使って、心が豊かになるということですよね。もっと植物的なことを考えれば、それによって私たちの年代の高齢者も、病院に行く医療費とかですね、そういうものが非常に下がって、 ひょっとするとそちらのコストを下げる方が大きいかもしれない。そういうことも全部含めましてですね、ヨーロッパの先生方と、それから日本の八尾さんがその行政の中枢であられますし、そして、私と私のチームの若い先生たちで、私たちが開発してきた、QOL というものを掲げた評価の方法というものを、いろんなアプリケーションをやりましたので、それをご紹介するということも含めて、最後に、張先生、ジョニー・ジャン先生が入っていただき、ジェミー・レイザー先生は、アジア開発銀行の交通のトップでありまして、これは先進国、いわゆる先進国で通用するものは途上国で通用するわけではない。そういう観点から、これをデベロッピングカントリーズに展開するにはどうしたらいいかという、こういうご批判とこの展望も話していただけると思いますし、ジュニー・ジャン先生にはコロナの WCTRS のタスクフォースの共同議長を私と一緒にやっていただいているわけですので、そちらの観点からもこの本当に今日の重要な課題として、それを含めてどういうふうに評価したらいいかというところで、今日のシンポジウムが意味のあるものになれば大変嬉しいと思います。ではよろしくお願いいたします。それでは、Now, I would like to start session 1。はい。このセッション1は4人の方々に話をいただきます。これはヨーロッパの3カ国と日本において、この50年を経て、今日現在ですね、どういうふうにこの評価のシステムを変更というか改良すればいいかと、何が問題になっているかという話と、その改良変更した時のバックグラウンドとなっているセオリーをお話しいただきたいと思います。それでは最初が、ロジャー・ビッカマン先生ですが、ロジャー・ビッカマン先生は、先ほど大体紹介しましたけども、一言で言うと、ミスター・チャンネル・トネルと言われている先生でありまして、そのカンテベリーにあるケント大学の先生でもあったもんですから、そのチャンネル・トネルができることによっていったヨーロッパにどういう社会経済的な変化をもたらすかという、これのもう世界きってのオーソリティでもあります。トランスポートポリシーという、今世界でトップのジャーナルのエディターインチーフもやられております。それではロジャー・ビッカーマン先生お願いします。So please share your file on. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Yoshi. Thank you, Professor Hayashin. Thank you to ADBI as well for their participation in this. It's a pleasure to be able to speak. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to people wherever they are.
Roger, maybe better to be closer to your microphone. Yeah.
Is that okay?
通訳のこと大丈夫ですか?
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Let's recall the fact that the UK has this very well established transport analysis guidance, which cost benefit analysis is at the heart of it, but it's only for the economic case. It also has much wider things, and the cost benefit doesn't rule everything in terms of this. The final decisions are based on judgment. And this is fine for routine investment decisions based on transport needs, but it doesn't necessarily work as well for large scale projects. And increasingly in the United Kingdom, there is a concern that transport should be used for what is now called the levelling up agenda, to address regional disparities. And that's where we need to think about the wider sorts of effects with this, particularly with projects that are thought to be transformational. The cost-benefit analysis, in order to ensure consistency across government, is based on guidance not just from the Department for Transport, but also from the Treasury. So Majesty's Treasury has a green book which tries to ensure consistency across all government investment decisions. And the key elements in that, such as the discount rate and the appraisal period, are set there by the green book. And that is now also focusing on this key levelling up agenda as a core element in this. Within that, the transport analysis guidance establishes key values such as the value of time savings, accident costs, and so on, and also provides a consistency in the demand modelling requirements. And that's constantly under revision. And there is a current set of discussions set out in what's called a route map for this. And that's looking at a series of core issues: how to deal with lower economic growth, particularly following Brexit, which has had a profound shock on the UK economy; on issues like uncertainty and how to define scenarios, different scenarios for how to solve particular problems; looking at the length of the appraisal period and how to deal with changing values of costs and benefits, and particularly the problem of optimism bias, both in the uncertainty over scheme costs, but also optimism in demand forecasts. And that comes back then to this levelling up and the transformational impacts, as well as dealing with the important environmental issues such as reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the value of the natural environment, and so on, which all have to be dealt with in this. One of the things where the UK has moved well ahead of many other countries is in terms of bringing on wider economic impacts beyond just the user benefits in transport projects. Wider economic impacts that arise when market failures occur in markets that are affected by the transport improvement and that will impact on welfare and the value for money. And there are three basic sources of these wider economic effects. One is induced investment, when a transport project leads to increased investment in an area that then affects the welfare and output effects. The employment effects on labour supply and people moving between more or less productive jobs. And finally, and most importantly, the impact on productivity that arises through agglomeration. And these wider economic impacts have to be included whenever the effects are likely to be significant in this. Now, market failures arise, as economists know, through the existence of imperfect competition, such that price is not equal to marginal cost. And that might arise because of a small number of firms in the market, the usual monopoly problems, because of barriers to entry that gives certain advantages to firms that are already in the industry, and therefore their ability to extort market power. But it also arises because of tax distortions that lead to impacts on investment decisions and decisions on labour supply as well, where there is a tax wedge that applies between the wages that are paid by employers and the take-home pay that people have in their pocket. But it can also arise through differences in product variety. Number of different varieties of products can change the degree of competition that exists, and issues within labour markets themselves that lead to frictional or structural unemployment. Frictional unemployment through the problems of search and matching jobs to particular candidates, or wage rigidities that lead to structural unemployment. All of these things can provide to market failures that lead to the change in the transport costs not being directly reflected in the way that people respond to those effects. Particularly important in this is the effect of agglomeration. And this is about access to economic mass, or sometimes called effective density, sometimes access to economic mass, and how that relates to productivity. This goes back to the ideas that big cities which arise through having very efficient transport systems are more productive in many cases than small cities, so that city size has an impact on the productivity of firms, and that leads to a cumulative causation rather than a sort of self-balancing effect. And this has two sorts of effects. One is the static effects, where lower travel costs bring firms and employees closer together, and so that they're more able to access those jobs, and that increases clustering and raises productivity. But they're also more difficult to handle, but important dynamic effects, where changes in economic activity lead to changes in density themselves. Increases in productivity in one area may, of course, be coming at the expense of losses in another area, but it's not a zero-sum game. And therefore, it's something that's important in terms of that, of thinking about the way that the changes in productivity in one area, say a regional productivity effect, must also be seen to be creating a national gain in productivity so that there can be some form of compensation. But there are problems with the methodology. First of all is the extent of identifying the extent of these market failures. Secondly, estimating the agglomeration elasticities, and work is continually going on to try and refine these in the UK. And that's leading us to move from the idea of this being done on sectoral specialization and agglomeration to possibly one of skill specialization. So this is not about firms clustering, it's about skills clustering, so that firms may not necessarily all move to one location, but they may move particular activities to locations where there are important external effects. And there'll clearly be regional local variations in this, but getting the appropriate data and the cost of analysis is very serious in this. We have a number of problems where we try to identify effects on productivity by different regions or different areas because of the way that firms' output is reported. Many firms actually report all of their activity through their head office, which may be located in one particular place, but doesn't reflect the way that their activities are spread out across the country. So there are problems of dealing with that with some data sets. But particularly importantly with big projects is defining the access to economic mass in a case where we've got multiple cities. We know that effective density declines quite steeply away from a new infrastructure, but accessibility may well be discontinuous. Access to high-speed rail lines, for example, only at places where there are stations on that line. And what is important to firms may not be this sort of general definition of accessibility, but actually connectivity in terms of the way things relate business to business. And that's important when we start looking at these transformational impacts. And what do we mean by that? Well, the Treasury Green Book defines transformational change in terms of a qualitative change so that behavior changes. And I think that's an important thing. It's recognizing the fact that behavior doesn't stay the same, so that historically estimated elasticities of response may not be so important or not be so accurate in a case where there is something that is transformational. And that introduces into this a strategic dimension where you have a specific policy objective that you're trying to achieve that may lie outside the conventional properties of a transport cost benefit analysis and provides an external constraint on the economic case. And that's in terms of looking at this balance between local and national impacts and their distributional impacts. And just give you an example of this. The UK has been for a long time agonizing over whether to build what's called HS2, a high-speed rail network connecting London with Birmingham, Manchester and Leeds, connecting together some of the biggest and most dynamic cities within the UK economy. That has been controversial on environmental grounds, but also faces the problem of escalating costs and the value for money of the proposed network. A review in 2019, headed by a man called Douglas Oakerby, actually looked at this and just focusing mainly on the right-hand three columns in terms of this. The core economic case presented by the promoters of HS2, the 2017 economic case, worked on the basis that the total cost will be just over 83 billion pounds sterling. The recalculations done by this review suggested that those costs would be well over 100 billion pounds. And the effect of that is to reduce the benefit cost ratio of this economic case, with or without wider economic impacts, from around 2 to really very little over 1, making the project very, very marginal indeed. But as is pointed out here, the benefits here are based on a 60-year appraisal period. If you increase it to 100 years, you can easily get back to a BCR of 2. The framework ignores the dynamic effects on land use. How will firms respond to the new connectivities that are provided by this infrastructure? And the project is also based as if it exists within a vacuum. For example, no complementary rail investments that would actually enhance the value of the project and would enhance the way that its benefits can be rolled out to a much wider group within society. So how do we capture those claims, those feedback effects, the tipping points, the threshold effects, which are very different from this constant use of marginal analysis? And of course, particularly the fact that you may well find a situation in which there are multiple equilibria in terms of this. So we need to identify where there is a potential for transformation and think about the transmission mechanisms and the complementarities that may exist there. So this implications for appraisal are that we have to go beyond the traditional marginal analysis. We need to think very much about what it is that the project is trying to do, not just that it's reducing times taken to get between different areas and so on. But it needs a detailed analysis. It's no good just saying, oh yes, well, it's all right, the economic case doesn't stack up, but it may well be important. We need to think about the way that we bring in increasing returns and cumulative causation as part of the transformation process. And that means being very careful about the narrative that we're applying. And this is not just about size. Size isn't the main determinant. It's about understanding the drivers of behavioral change in this and understanding how complementary policies and packages of interventions may well be important here. So how do we go forward in terms of this? The clear narrative, I've already suggested several times, is really important, and the understanding behavioral change is important. Understanding the limits of elasticities that are based on marginal analysis and understanding the impact of increasing returns and where they apply. The idea that skills may cluster, and that is the important thing. And this goes right back to the heart of Marshall's analysis of external effects about people clustering because they had common interests in an area. And that, it seems to me, moves away from that monocentric urban model that has traditionally been at the heart of much we do in transport. It thinks about the way that a transport improvement will impact on a labor market, which is about bringing people into a core center, to a model where we've got effectively providing the opportunity for cities to compete with one another. And therefore, that will change things. As my colleague from University of Oxford, Tony Venables, has identified, it's about the relative effects of expanding cities, which is what we've done in the traditional way, or connecting cities, which is a different sort of approach. So just to conclude on this, transformation, seems to me, is easy to define in theory. We have a nice definition there about it's the way that it affects the way that people behave. But it's much more difficult to define in terms of metrics that we can use in an expanded cost-benefit analysis framework or something like that, and to find clear evidence of how it works, because we tend to rely so much on historical evidence for basing our future investments rather than thinking about how the world may change in the future. The importance of narrative, much less emphasis, I think, on big, comprehensive black box type models that try to solve everything in terms of this. And that's where I think that there have been many disadvantages of going down different routes to try and do this. Understanding that estimated elasticities are very specific to the case for which they were estimated. You can't simply take elasticities that are found, for example, in London, a big metropolitan city, and apply that to changes in a small city, or particularly to apply it to a project which links cities together. Understanding how those important increasing returns occur, and that's not just about scale, and about this move from accessibility to the idea of connectivity, understanding how business to business links work and how we can capture that in the sort of things that we do. And that means rethinking the traditional focus on commuting to one about understanding how cities work together. And I think, just as a final comment, it's very important to recognize that we're in an important position now where, because of the changes that have been brought about by the pandemic, people are rethinking not just about whether they work more from home rather than going to an office, but how they conduct business. I don't tend to believe that the world will work from home and do everything on Zoom or one of the other platforms, because I think that people will find that difficult. There's an old idea about trying to find out what the minimum value of an investment is before you need to meet the people in person. I remember all too well, and referring back to Professor Hayashi's comment about the Channel Tunnel at the beginning, which is many years ago now, but the then head of the project at a time when the UK government decided not to invest in a linking high-speed rail line, Japanese investors in the tunnel decided that they may well withdraw their investment. The head of the Channel Tunnel project at that time, Alistair Morton, was on the first plane to Tokyo to confront his investors face to face and assure them that the project was going ahead, whatever the Prime Minister may say. So I think that we will still see the need to meet in person and not just on these sorts of platforms. And that is going to be important as a way of thinking about how we need to continue to develop our appraisal processes. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Excellent speech. Now, I would like to invite questions and comments. Any questions or comments are very welcome. And taking this time, I'm afraid I have raised a question that is in the chat box. My question is how UK's system, today's system, considers the transport, life, people's life, and industry interaction?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. We do think about these, but they're not considered yet as a formal part of the metric. In the discussions that go on through revising this route map, clearly there are those things. And that, I think, is where this idea of thinking about connectivity rather than accessibility becomes important. It's about what do people connect to? How do people connect in those ways? And I think that that is something that is very much at the back of mind. Maybe not quite put in the same language that you would put it in, but certainly there are issues that lie behind some of the current discussions that go on. Right, I see there's a question here about guidelines on how the narratives that have to be written. I think this is from Laurent Tridemy. Those are things that are being discussed at the moment, how you actually define the sorts of narratives so that it doesn't just become a self-seeking justification for a project that isn't really worthwhile. We already have part of the economic case has to be justified in terms of a clear narrative about how it's going to affect things, not just in terms of numbers, but how it's going to change behaviors and so on. But we don't yet have, because this is at a stage of being developed at the moment. We don't yet have formal guidance on it, but it is an important point to be able to make this an objective rather than a purely subjective piece of analysis. And I see Anil Kar has asked about measuring transformational benefits of HSR in countries, and does it take sufficient care of the situations like the COVID pandemic? I think that's difficult one, because I think we've only started to recognize the importance of the development of these transformational effects. And it's tended, rather like wider economic impacts in the first case, which was very much sort of, can we just add something on to this in order to make a project worthwhile? In terms of the resilience to the pandemic, as I was suggesting right at the end of my presentation, I think we're at a position now where we don't yet have sufficient understanding of how the world will change, whether it will go back to something like the situation beforehand, or that there will be a complete sort of behavioral change, and that's and that's a problem. Just to take in the sort of last few seconds, two other comments. One about whether skills only cluster when firms of human capital agglomerate. Well, yes, but it depends on the skills, I think, in this. We know that that certain skills don't actually need, creative skills, for example, don't necessarily need a huge amount of physical capital. They just simply need interactions. This is the way that ideas bounce off people by clustering. That's the great advantage of universities, that they bring together clusters of people interested in things. It's the classic example of Silicon Valley. It brought together ideas and things bounced off it, and so that and connectivity over long distances is fine, but I think there needs to be a certain degree of core clustering for that to work. What the high-speed rail can do is to bring together the different skills that need to apply in a particular case. And thank you, Eve. Wider economic benefits when economic growth is lower than expected. I think that wider economic benefits become more important when economic growth is lower than expected, because it's about how you actually generate the rate of return out of what is a lower rate of economic growth. And so I think from a policy perspective, it's very important to think very clearly about how those bits of agglomeration can actually squeeze the maximum amount of advantage out of that. And there is one, is an identified framework to assess railway projects. Well, we've got a very, very detailed analysis, particularly for predicting railway demand in normal circumstances in the UK. And that is used as a means of assessing certainly all smaller scale railway investments in the UK, not these big transformational projects, but ones like junction improvements on railways, electrification projects, and so on. And that is standard procedure.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this important symposium, because we are talking about the future and not so much about the past, although the investigations which you did, Yoshi, with your team referred to the past methods of assessment in several countries. And indeed, we have learned from the failures which we have made in the past, and therefore I will not only talk about the past methodologies, but about the future changes. Here we are, which we are planning to do. So first, I'll start with the present methodology for the evaluations of projects in the context of the German Federal Master Plan for transport infrastructure, and in particular, I will refer to the treatment of environmental and spatial components and to strategic environmental analysis, which are new components in the method. But nevertheless, there are very critical comments from environmental stakeholders, which I will also refer to. And at the end, I refer to some, say, activities of strong stakeholder groups with respect to legal reform of transport to enforce the Ministry of Transport to take up the new ideas for a change of planning and a change of the use methodologies. So the basic pillars of the present methods is, of course, a transport forecast on the base of socio-economic development. And then it follows by the investigation of the maintenance needs and the replacement investments, and I will tell you why. And at the end, there follows the assessment of new investment and major upgrades. So the reason why focusing on maintenance is simply that maintenance and replacement investments and small upgrades are dominating the investment in Germany. The main activities for infrastructure extensions have been done 40 or 50 years ago, and therefore now it is the time for a major replacement. There are already several bridges which have broken down. Not only Italy has this problem, also Germany has this problem. So several bridges are closed, in particular for trucking, and so there are high needs for replacement. In the case of rail, I think we did a good step forward, and this is one example for a good experience in Germany, which can be given also to other countries. So the federal government has agreed with the infrastructure manager on a performance and financing agreement for the next 10 years. And so the infrastructure manager knows exactly what the funds are, which can be used for replacement investments in the next 10 years, independent on the budget situation. It is not necessary to apply for the next year for a budget for replacement investment. It is decided that these funds are given. So the share of maintenance investment now is about 70%. And this underlines the importance of this point of investment, of this kind of investment in the future. So new investments only is for about 30% of the total budget. So the new investment then is governed by a cost-benefit analysis, but there are also other components, other modules, which are included in the whole procedure. There's a module on nature and the environment. This is module B. Module C is on spatial development, and module D on urban development. So let me start with the module B on nature and environment. It includes, in the first instance, impacts on biodiversity and natural habitats, and it ends with a risk analysis, with a scoring for the risk, whether it is high or whether it is low, and it can be, say, mastered. The module C on spatial development reminds me to the, say, discussion which has been initiated in the speech of Roger Wickerman. So it is not the German idea to strengthen the monocentric development of big cities. On the contrary, we have a spatial development law which clearly says that the lower hierarchy of cities has to be strengthened by allocation of clear functions. Okay, so not only for the administration, but also for culture, for education, and for other kinds of businesses. So it is so that in Germany, we try to avoid over-concentration of the big cities by strengthening the smaller cities in the environment, the suburbs and the cities in the environment. And therefore, the so-called development axes are in particular a basic element of spatial development. The development axis define the way how the cities are increasing in the future, not by strengthening their core areas, but by strengthening the sub-areas which are combined by infrastructure, in particular for public transport. So in the case of the urban module, accessibility and separation effects are in the core. That means separation effects should be avoided by transport infrastructure. And presently, this means that also existing roads are deconstructed and lanes of roads are changed to biking lanes, for instance, because this has become very popular. Biking has increased very much, in particular in the course of the pandemic in the last year. And therefore, say, more and more cities tend to reduce the space for roads and increases space for biking. The SEA at the end means there is a strategic environmental analysis of all impacts of the comprehensive plan. So this is the difference compared to the modules A to C or A to D. These modules relate to projects, while the strategic environmental analysis, according to European law, relates to the comprehensive investment plan. So when it comes to cost-benefit analysis, the German method is very traditional. It's a neoclassical approach, including generalized cost and monetized external cost. And so the main difference compared with previous approaches is that, say, the treatment of induced and diverted traffic is done now in a more consistent way. What means that not only, say, cost differentials are included, but also changes of the demand. Okay, and this is a way how to evaluate also, say, modal shifts from road to rail, even if the time of rail is higher than the time needed for road transport, which usually would imply a negative evaluation. But in this case, it is added by the so-called implicit utility measurement, which says if the behavior of people is relevant and not the time difference. So there is no consideration of wider impacts presently in the German method. And the modules B to D are evaluated by usual scoring methods, not by economic tools. And there are no formal provisions for, say, summarizing the impacts of economic and other modules of assessment. It can lead to a change of the monetary prioritization, and this is a decision of the Ministry of Transport. In the case of very positive environmental assessment, for instance, with very low risk, then the projects can get a higher priority because the ministry in this case expects little problems for the approval processes. And you may know that these approval processes can take very long in Germany. They can take 10 years and more. And therefore, the ministry is interested in realizing as many projects as possible and therefore giving the environmentally less problematic investment projects a higher priority. On the other hand, if the environmental assessment is very negative, then the projects can be cancelled from the list of candidates. Now, there are very critical comments with respect to this German methodology since I think about 20 years. Since about 20 years, the Scientific Advisory Committee of the Ministry is suggesting a change of methodology and the change of the planning process. And this is followed now by the federal government, the Federal Environmental Agency and other environmental groups, which have started strong initiatives for changing the planning process as well as the planning methodologies which are applied in the different stages of the planning process. So the planning process is suggested to be subdivided by the strategic level. And on the strategic level, so clear targets should be set, clear narratives should be developed, such as the zero carbon footprint until 2050, also for the transport sector, and a roadmap, okay, how to approach this goal in the time from 2020 to 2050. This means, for instance, for the year 2030, a reduction of 55% compared with 1990. So this would be a clear target, while presently in the methodology, the goals are defined only in a qualitative way. Everything should become better and nobody will be against that. But as soon as you define the clear targets, then things become difficult to translate into clear actions. The second level is the systems level, which is, say, not applied presently because we have only a project-based evaluation, but not an evaluation of the configurations of the networks, of the rail and the road and the inland waterway networks. This is not the case, and this should be added. And at the third level, we have a project level, which has to fulfill the strategic level targets and has to be appropriate for the systems level, for the configuration of networks, which should fulfill the strategic targets. So the major gaps presently in the methodology are there are no wider economic impacts regarded. The strategic environmental impacts are, say, analyzed at the end and not during the planning process and the method, the evaluation process. There's no strategic social analysis of distributive goals and quality of life. And last but not least, the international connectivity is not considered. There's an external dimension. Germany is surrounded by 7 countries. There are 7 neighbor countries, and there's a very close connex to the European Union countries and also to the UK. Also after the Brexit, there's still a close connection. And this external dimension is until now not considered in the German evaluation methods. It's only considered by the European Union, but the European Union has not the planning competence for infrastructure. So the introduction of wider economic benefits is a little bit different in my view compared to what the British or the UK way is, insofar as we concentrate with wider economic impacts on the employment impacts first, okay, the impacts of multiplier and investment activities, multiplier accelerator are the first, and they apply in particular for underemployed economies, and many economies are underemployed. So this yellow part is the this first benefit profile with the short and medium term. Then the cost reductions become dominant in the second phase, and in the third phase, the impacts on productivity. And productivity are not only effects which stem from migration of factors from low to high productivity areas, as it was traditionally, say, proposed by the Krugman analysis of spatial impacts. In our view, these effects also occur in the less condensed regions, in particular in the course of the digitalization of economies, then the concentration of economic activities in cities is less important and does not contribute so much to productivity increase. So in my view, the idea of Paul Romer, the Nobel Prize winner of 2018, is very remarkable. He has changed the macroeconomic view on the influence of productivity very much. In his view, human capital in research and development is a driving force, and this driving force can also influence the infrastructure. So many aspects of transport infrastructure and the transport system also refer to research and development, in particular with respect to digitalization of processes, and this will influence the productivity in the future. And this is not much dependent on the place where this activity occurs, whether it is in agglomerations or outside of agglomerations. The important thing is that the technology is changing over time, and this is influenced by human capital and its influence on the infrastructure and transport systems development. So when it comes to put these things together, the modeling of transport would be extended in the future by an integrated assessment, including these transportation models for passenger and freight, which is a difficult part because we have to go into details, okay, with this respect. This makes it difficult to directly connect the transportation models to models of economics, to energy and the environment, but in particular, it has to be tried to bring the results of these models together on a common platform. And this common platform should include the wider economic impacts, as I've tried to define them, in particular with respect to their impact on productivity. The SEA, this is the strategic environmental analysis, the QOL, which is quality of life analysis, and the external dimension, which is the connectivity of the transportation system with a system of neighbors and continents. Okay, for instance, the relationship between Europe or Germany and the Asian countries alongside of the Trans-Siberian corridors. These results can be compiled and put together by an integrated assessment. These methods of integrated assessments are known from climate research. Okay, also the climate research activities are summarized by integrated assessment models, and these models put together all information on one platform, exchange this information, try to derive a common picture for the future development. And what can be done for the critical points of climate change, the tipping points, can also be done for the economy and the ecology and the quality of life. In my view, there is still the question whether it is possible to put complex models together. This is tried by European Commission research activities, which are not too successful nowadays, but the idea is to put things together and can also be done on a qualitative basis, on a narrative basis, and on the basis of more aggregate information which is put together. So this concludes my contribution. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Werner, for your excellent speech. Now, there are some questions. Can you see the question box?
I try to go through it. I have no access. Here we are. I have to stop the presentation. Here we are. And now to the chat.
Not chat, but Q&A.
F&A, okay, yeah. So there's a question of Dr. Anil Kare, right? What is the advantage level based on maintenance of German road and rail infrastructure? As is known, compared with, will help drive the benefits against cost. Well, I have to say that the benefits are not calculated, okay, in the investments, in the maintenance investment strategy. It is presupposed that maintenance is necessary to preserve the present condition of the network and to upgrade it, okay, adjust it to the future needs. But there is no new assessment of environmental impacts and of economic impacts. In the on the federal part of the infrastructure, this assumption widely is given and is confirmed by reality. In urban areas, it is not confirmed by reality because the cities are starting to change the structure of their road networks, as I told you, and thus there will be a change, and this change has to be assessed, okay? If you need more biking lanes, like in the city of Copenhagen, you have to use road space to do that. So then going back, what is obtaining social license in the impact assessment? A social license, I don't understand what a social license should be. So what is going on in Germany is to try to introduce a reform of legacy, okay? Such that it is obligatory to include the social aspects and the environmental aspects into the planning. And that would make a difference compared to the present situation where the Ministry of Transport can decide. We have, say, 12 years of the ministries of transport which were governed by conservative ministers who did not much for the environment. They did more for the roads, in particular for the road investments in their election districts, okay? And there is much resistance against these habits for the future. And there are strong groups fighting for a change of the legacy, okay, to enforce the ministry to follow the more the rules of sustainability rather than say, to favor the election districts. Now, the Pouliot, what's the best project selection criteria at the project level? Well, at the project level, I think we can still apply cost-benefit technology, because in this case, we have to assume that the projects are widely independent on others. But as soon as, say, there are strong interdependencies between the projects, then it is very important to, say, take up these interdependencies and go to the network level, okay, to evaluate projects. This is a main requirement which would improve the present planning. Then Mr. Pazindu, the QL specifically focus on large-scale projects. Well, in my view, the QL should also include smaller projects, not only high-speed projects, but also the accompanying projects in suburbs or in sub-cities which have no direct access, okay, to the high-speed network. So the investment in the secondary networks and the improvement of living conditions in the regions outside of the big agglomerations should be included in the QRL. So this is my view, and I think it also corresponds to the approaches of Yoshi Ayashi. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, at the moment, no further questions. Okay, now, good timing. Thank you very much, Professor Rothengatter, for your excellent speech and good discussions. Then now move on to the presentation by Professor Yves Crozet.
So thank you for the invitation. I will speak mainly about transport investment in urban areas. So as you know, we have a large high-speed rail network in France and a large motorway network. But my focus, it's about urban areas. So just to introduce the topic, you have to make a clear distinction between the Paris region, 12 million inhabitants, and the very dense part of the city is 7 million inhabitants, and the other French regions where we have only 3 big cities with more than 1 million inhabitants. You have Lyon, Marseille, and Lille, and you have a lot of cities with less than 1 million inhabitants. So it's why in the first part, I will put the focus on Paris region and the Grand Paris Express project. And then in the second and third part on the other cities, the smaller cities. So just a quick look about the mobility in Paris. You observe that in the central part of Paris, 2.5 million inhabitants, you have mainly the mobilities using public transit, 2.3 million trips per day, in comparison with only 0.4 with cars. But if you look at the global mobility in the Paris region, you observe that the total in 2018, it's at the right hand on the graph, you have more than 14 million trips per day with car and 9 with public transit. So it's why 12 years ago, the President Sarkozy decided to launch a new project, what we call Grand Paris Express, that is to say 200 kilometers of new underground metro line. And as you can know, as you can see, the central part of Paris here, you have a lot of metro line, and the idea is to have a first ring here, what we call line 15. And then if we look at why we develop this idea, it's because we had to boost the economic growth, because the dynamism of Paris region was rather low in comparison with Toulouse, with Lyon, with Marseille, with Bordeaux. And the idea was to push up the economic growth in the Paris region and to justify the project by wider economic benefits. It's important to underline that the project is a political project decided 12 years ago, and the first research about the potential wider economic benefits, it's only 9 years ago. And when you look at the result of the cost-benefit analysis of Grand Paris Express, you observe that the last line, the internal rate of return is rather high, 8%. The net present value is very close to 30 billion euros. But when you look at the total benefits, 67 billion euros, you observe that a lot of benefits are coming from the supposed wider economic benefits, and mainly from new jobs and from agglomeration effects. And clearly, I think that the result of the Grand Paris Express will be agglomeration effects, as explained by Roger Wickerman. But I have some doubts about the new jobs. That is to say, jobs coming maybe from other regions in France. And it's why when there was an audit in 2015 done by the General Commissioner to Investment, and the audit mentioned that the innovative evaluation method used rely heavily on the pace and location of population and jobs, which are outside the purview of the Société du Grand Paris. And it's why there is a risk of undervaluing the cost of building and overestimating the benefits. And you can understand that if you look at different scenarios without the Grand Paris Express and with low scenarios and high scenarios, you observe that the main hypothesis of productivity gains due to agglomeration effect is based on the idea that we will have less jobs in the peripheries and more jobs in the denser part of the city to increase the connectivity and the productivity. And we can discuss this hypothesis because if you look at the past, we have now more and more jobs in the second crown of the Paris region and not in the central part of the cities. And we can add also that we have now a lot of delays. That is to say, we at the end of last year, we only finished this part of the new line, line 14, and we have now a lot of delays for the other lines. So the cost is probably higher than expected, and the benefit will be lower. So clearly, we will have wider economic benefits thanks to the Grand Paris Express, but probably lower than expected. If we turn now to the other part of France, it's medium-sized and small-sized cities, what we observe is what I call the accessibility turn. The accessibility was well defined 60 years ago by Walter Hansen, and with some key elements, the density, D, and the generalized cost. And if we move to the accessibility definition in urban areas, the decay function is a negative exponential. And due to that, you have just to increase a little the speed or to reduce the cost, that is to say, to reduce the generalized cost, and immediately you increase a lot accessibility. So during the last, the previous time, what I call the first age of accessibility, we have mainly the search for speed. Speed is the main factor for the improvement of the quality of life, and the dream of policymakers is the same than the dream of commuters, faster and cheaper. But the result of higher speed is urban sprawl, collective issues, and higher travel time budget, individual issues. Just have a look to the situation in my region, in Lyon. Here you have the central part of the cities, and here you have a circle at 60 kilometers from Lyon. So 50 years ago, the average distance from home to work was less than 5 kilometers for the majority of the municipalities. If you look now in 1990 and in 2011, you observe a lot of people living at 20, 30, 40 kilometers from the city of Lyon, with an average distance from home to work between 15 and 20 or sometimes more kilometers. So clearly the main issue is that due to the speed increase, you obtain a big urban sprawl. So the result is not exactly in the methodology, but in the decision of the local politician. Public transit became the priority to keep or to improve accessibility, and then speak was becoming less and less important than the capacity, the reliability, the frequency, and the comfort of public transit. And it's why we develop in France a lot of tramway line, of light rail, and we develop, as in Germany, walking and cycling and so on. And you can observe the results on the average speed on small roads in green. You observe that on the vertical axis, it's not the speed, it is the index. The average speed was 100 as an index in 1987. And you observe that on the small road, mainly the urban road in green, now the average speed is more than 20% less than 20 years ago. So clearly, the local politician decided to increase the generalized cost of car mobility by reducing the speed. And if you look at the decision at the core of the cities, you have here the urban area of Lyon, and you observe here that accessibility by public transit, when it is red or pink, accessibility by public transit is better than accessibility by car. And when it's blue, accessibility by car is better than accessibility by public transit. And here you observe that along the motorways, in red, you have the motorways, you have a better accessibility by car. And along the public transit network, metro and light rail, you have a better accessibility. But it's only a small part of the agglomeration area. In the other parts, the accessibility is mainly better with car. So we have clearly what I call the accessibility turn. That is to say, we have the public transit preference. You have the look at the land use issues and their impact on proximity, the social issues. But clearly, we are facing a big difference between the central part of the cities and the peripheries. And it's what I want to explain with some maps. Here you have the accessibility maps to jobs in the area of Lyon, my city. So here you have the denser part of the cities, and you have the access by public transit. And if I compare this map with the accessibility to jobs with car, you obtain this map. So what if you compare the two, clearly the accessibility is better with the car than with public transit. So this is the result. The result is the difference between accessibility by public transit minus accessibility by car. And you obtain everywhere in green a negative result. The accessibility by car, it's much better than accessibility by public transit in dark green, and the accessibility by car remain better even if it's light green. It's for a cost of car mobility of 25 euro cents per kilometer, and you pay only 10 cents per kilometer for the public transit. Suppose that you change the system. Suppose that you say, okay, we have to give less subsidies to the public transit. And if people have to pay the public transit, that is to say 30 euro cents per kilometer, immediately you have everywhere a better accessibility by car. But so finally, the local politician decided not only to reduce the speed of car, but step by step to increase the cost of car mobility. So I think that's the coming change in the accessibility term is the fact that we will have road pricing in order to increase the attractiveness of public transit. And it's important to underline that it's not a congestion charging only in the central part of the city, but a systematic distance payment to cover the cost of road use, including the external cost. It's obviously a step-by-step process where we will have lower speed, not only lower speed, it's already the case, but we will have an higher cost. And you observe the result here. If you have you double the cost of car mobility, it's just an hypothesis, you obtain in yellow the location where the accessibility by public transit is better than the accessibility by car. And clearly it is probably the next step of the accessibility turn. The first step is to put the focus on density and public transit. The second step is to reduce the speed of car. And the coming third step is to increase the cost of car mobility, maybe not by doubling the price like on the map, but by a step-by-step process. So as a conclusion, the main problem we have in France, not especially in Paris, but in the main metropolitan areas in France, is that we have a domination of auto mobility, and then probably without any official methodology, the public decision makers decided to give the priority to public transit, to give the priority to land use optimization, proximity, density, to develop some new mobility services, including share mobility. If you increase the cost of car mobility, maybe you push up the shared mobility. And it's my proposal to set up a road pricing, a distance road pricing on the whole road network. So the most important component of the accessibility turn is therefore the end of the reduction of travel costs as the main objective function of the decision makers, the reduction of travel costs by car as the main objective function of the decision makers. And in relation with sustainable development goals, faster and cheaper is no more the source of the urban quality of life. And it is clearly a challenge for the cost-benefit analysis where time gains were so important. Thank you for
Thank you very much for your excellent presentation. And then now we accept questions. Can you see question and Q&A box? So it is, yes, on the bottom near the selection of language, Q&A, now you can see the question.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so perhaps I may read how is France planning for new urban transport system such as Hyperloop? If already into it, will it lead to very slow phasing out of conventional railroad transport systems?
Yes, clearly Hyperloop is not a priority in France especially for urban areas, because it's not necessary to have a speed of 1,000 kilometers just to do 20 or 50 kilometers. It's not useful. And we have a lot of questions about the cost of Hyperloop, cost for the public money and cost for passenger. But and it's why clearly in France, the priority now is given mainly to slow modes in urban areas. For instance, the fact that we developed the tramway line instead of the metro line. If you look at, for instance, the city of Bordeaux, 30 years ago, the main project of Bordeaux was to create an underground metro line. And finally, the decision was to develop a light rail, not underground, because it was a way to reduce the pressure of automobility. And clearly the priority in France now is to reduce the pressure of automobility, but not to increase the speed, even of the regional trains. What is important is frequency, is the comfort, the quality, and we have a lot of improvement to do in this domain.
Okay, it's very interesting. Perhaps a bit related, but from Jenny Yamamoto, you mentioned that policymakers prioritizes public transit, but can you explain what were the main factors behind these decisions? In other words, what was their motivation?
Yes, the main motivation was to reduce the pressure of automobility on the quality of life in the cities. That is to say, to give more space to pedestrians, to bikers, to public transit, and less space to the automobility because of accidents, because of pollution, and so on. Maybe it's kind of not very rational decision, but it is clearly the demand of people living close to the roads to reduce the pressure of automobility. And if I look at the question, Florent Trédemi, so clearly with the COVID, what we observe now is a rush to the peripheries. So the urban sprawl will be bigger in the coming years because of the COVID and because of the home working and digitalization. And it's exactly why we will have more and more people living in the peripheries that we have to put the pressure on car mobility. Because the result of COVID is today less people in public transit and more people on the road with their cars.
Yeah, thank you. It's very interesting. Under the corona situation, many people stay home or not going to the workplace every day. And then, but all the people are sitting within the house, particularly in Japanese small houses, another conflict within the family. So we now are discussing we need to consider again neighborhood district community based planning. That includes a very important transport tool that is walking or biking, such as slower modes than rapidly going to a workplace. So the way of thinking is definitely is changing. Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, thank you. And now I hope all the Q&A at the moment are answered. Okay, thank you very much indeed, Professor Crozet. Okay, now move on to the presentation by Mr. Mitsuhiro Yao. He's General Director of International Affairs of Road Bureau, Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism. Okay, so please go ahead. Now we can see your slide very well. Please go ahead.
Thank you for introducing me. First of all, I would like to say thank you to ADBI and Chubu University, including Professor Hayashi, for inviting me such kind of a forum. Let me share with you how we make efforts to evaluate disaster prevention in road project evaluation in Japan. Okay. So first, I will explain the evaluation system for road projects in Japan briefly. From a legal view, we have the Act on the evaluation of policies on the top of the system. And based on this system, several kinds of evaluation or assessment, including policy assessment, individual public works evaluations are conducted. Focusing on the project evaluation, we carry out evaluation mainly at 4 stages. First, evaluation at planning stage. Second, pre-project evaluation for project approval. Third, re-evaluation under construction period. And the final one, fourth, post-project evaluation after project completion. We have to evaluate all projects at all stages now. As is often the case with many countries, pre-project evaluation for project approval attracts public attention most, because this evaluation directly leads to budget allocation, and many people focuses on cost-benefit analysis result, B/C value. However, about 25 years ago, when the evaluation system was established, many people misunderstood the role of B/C. Many people think B/C can determine the priority of the project, but actually B/C cannot do that. It is true, B/C is one of the most important indexes to evaluate the project, but it is just one of all indexes, such as project impact, project environment, and project something. And so this is our understanding about B/C. Anyway, B/C has attracted many people, and there occurred lots of discussions, such as project with B/C less than 1.0 should not be approved or not. Projects in rural area are at disadvantage because the traffic volume itself is originally very small. B/C does not include disaster impact or environmental impact, and etc., etc. One of the biggest triggers for introduction of disaster prevention function evaluation is the Tohoku earthquake, occurred on 11th of March 2011. As you may know, the earthquake was so large that it brought big tsunami with over 7 meters high. This earthquake damaged existing infrastructure a lot, but expressways which were planned on the high ground, considering tsunami, were still working and under operation here. As shown in the pictures, national roads along the seashore were damaged by the earthquake or tsunami like this. And while the expressways constructed on the high ground were still working and under operation. So expressways were working as a lifeline for emergency transport, including relief supplies. Based on this earthquake experience, we have developed the existing project evaluation method to evaluate disaster prevention functions. As a result, we have revised the evaluation manual in 2015. Regarding the new evaluation method, target disasters are earthquakes, tsunamis, as listed here. The left-hand side map shows Shikoku area. This is the Shikoku area. And its size is 19,000 square kilometers, accounting for 5% of Japan. And about 3.7 million people live there. So it's a very small island. So the population density is 200 per square kilometers. And in this map, there is a red circle and black circle and white circle and so on. For example, the red hubs, A-class hubs, show widely area hubs indicating location of local government. So this indicates the local government of Kagawa Prefecture. At the blue point, this point, B-class hubs indicate such transportation hubs as like ports here and interchanges here. And the right-hand side shows evaluation method. First, we calculate travel time between two hubs in two scenarios. One scenario is normal case, and other scenario is under disaster case. And then we calculate travel time under normal condition over travel time under disaster condition. Yeah, this is a very small, but maybe you can see a kind of an equation here. We define the vulnerability like 1 minus travel time under normal condition over travel time under disasters. So normally these values varies 0 to 1, and we would like to decrease this value. As you may know, Japan has lots of disasters, and we set several scenarios like tsunamis or earthquakes to evaluate disaster prevention functions based on disaster characteristics. Lastly, I would like to introduce one example for project evaluation with use of disaster vulnerability. As I have told, the index is defined as 1 minus travel time under normal condition over travel time at disaster condition. So if the index value become near 0 after the completion of the target, the project will be thought to be effective. So now the result is here. In Shikoku case, the index changed by the completion of the target highway project from 1.00 to 0.15 in two combinations of two hubs here. So the project can be thought effective from a point of view of disaster prevention. Let me share summary with you. First, ADBI-C is an important index, but it is very difficult to evaluate road project only based on ADBI-C. Second, therefore, we confirm impact of the project considering disasters, residents, corporation, etc. Third, a new method was introduced to evaluate disaster prevention function after the East Japan earthquakes. Going on to issues for the future. First, it is very important to improve evaluation method to evaluate the various impact of the project. Second, the corona spread brought a huge demand for home deliveries, but we still have no method to evaluate such physical distribution function. That is one issue. Third, in addition, spread of EV, electric vehicles, will probably change the characteristics of road project impact itself and have influence on maintenance work. So we have to re-evaluate the vehicles. Lastly, furthermore, spread of self-driving system will also have influence on road project impact and structure of infrastructure itself. For example, we need less shoulder space and we can make use of surplus space. Thank you very much. That is all of my presentation.
Thank you very much indeed for your excellent presentation. Now, may we have questions? Okay, so may I speak a little bit? Yes, of course, I was also very much concerned about how to preliminarily assess or evaluate the possible damage by big earthquake or big flood. So in many cases, such measures are used. That is, for example, when Kobe earthquake occurred, port of Kobe was damaged very much. And for several months or even more, that was not functioning. But in many cases, we calculate the damage, the closure period, and how many businesses should have been done if disaster did not come. However, the damage is much more, mechanized with the other entities. The closure of treatment of freights, much beyond that, because that will impact on the other industries, etc. So what happened was Kobe lost the position of northern Pacific route of a big route from America, and then Japan started to be passed, and then going to Busan, Korea, or Kaohsiung, Taiwan, or nowadays Shanghai. Of course, that is of course a matter of economic growth and stage of life cycle of countries, but still even more non-linear damage. So it's not easy to evaluate the possible damages. So how do you think about it?
Yeah, of course, it is very difficult to grasp all damages caused by the earthquake. And maybe in case of the very big earthquake, like Kobe earthquake or East Japan earthquake, maybe the affected area is so large that we cannot calculate all of the damage. So, however, maybe you can make a kind of a simulation which can estimate the damage cost of the damage impact on the economic itself. But maybe Professor Roger said before, as Professor Roger mentioned, I think it's not a good idea to make such a simulation machine because it cannot be accountable to the people. So we should make a kind of a very simple explanation to persuade people for the government to carry out the project. So I completely agree with Professor Roger Bickham in that less emphasis on comprehensive, big comprehensive model. So I think it's not a good idea to expand the, how can I say, to expand the calculation area of the benefit. That is my thought. So even though the benefit is limited, we have to, how can I say, we should evaluate the project based on the benefit.
Benefit which can be directly measured, you mean?
Yes. Yes.
There may be some different views.
Yeah, maybe, yes, I can understand.
Okay,
yes.
This is a good topic to discuss in the panel discussion, or maybe if you have a quick comment, Roger or Werner, now.
Not a quick comment, Yoshi, with respect to the complexity of models, because this can be addressed in the panel. Okay, I need a little bit more time, okay, to explain why it may be important also to apply more complex models to bring things together.
Okay.
My special question to Mr. Yao is, in Japan, the resilience of the road system is a very important challenge, okay, in planning. And to which extent do you also plan the redundancy of the system? Because there is some probability of, say, failure, okay, for motorways and so, or bridges. And therefore one could plan, say, alternative routes from the beginning, okay? Also, from the beginning, not when the emergency happens, but already in advance. So to which extent this aspect is also taken up in your planning system?
Okay, in principle, we have to build a two route. One of the route is expressway. And in parallel with that, we would like to build a very good national road. That is our basic plan policy. Yeah.
Okay.
So we would like to keep resilience. Yeah.
Okay. So Roger, you may wish to mention very quickly.
Yes, if I could, please. I think that there's an important point here is one of transparency in terms of being able to show that the effects that are calculated are ones that can be accepted by different stakeholders, and the extent to which different stakeholders have got access to a range of modeling opportunities. And that, I think, is one of the big challenges that we have, is to make sure that everyone who is a stakeholder in a project has got that degree of it. I'm having a lot of arguments at the moment about HS2 in the UK, because it is destroying large amounts of ancient woodland. How do you relate that to other things? And there are two sort of diametrically opposed views in this, which are very difficult to bring together. And I think we need to think much more about how you bring together those views so that people can accept a compromise view on this.
Okay, thank you very much. Very good discussion. Thank you so much, Mr. Yao, and comment you did. Now I have to have a quit here because we are now say a little bit maybe now how much we are rather behind now. Okay, so we had already say discussions, and although we have still more questions in Q&A, let me allow to include those questions for the panelists will consider. Please, panelists, look at these. And then shall we have now break until, or difficult to say 10 minutes.
Okay, welcome back to the second session for quality of life accessibility approach. So my name is Jun Zhang. I'm very happy to chair this session. From last session, I learned a lot from the very famous experts from all over the world. I'm working in Hiroshima University and have worked a lot with Professor Hayashi about COVID-19. This session, my role actually is very simple to keep time. We have 4 speakers, plus at the end of this all speak, Dr. James Leather will give some comments on the 4 speakers. Okay, with this, I would like to ask the first speaker to talk. Professor Hayashi, please start.
これで聞こえてますか？大丈夫ですね。はい。はい、それでは始めさせていただきます。私のタイトルはここに書いたような QOL Accessibility Method というものであります。まずどうしてこんなことを考えるようになったかというモチベーションがありまして、これは、まず今もうちょうど議論されてますけども、コストベネフィットアナリシスコンベンショナルなものが、私のように年齢を取ったものにとかですね、子どもたちの新しい道路ができたり鉄道ができても、価値がないというこういうふうにされてしまう。これおかしいんじゃないか。それからもう一つはクオリティオブライフをどういうふうに指標化しようかということを考えてきました。でこれは今もたくさん議論がありましたが、ノンマネタリーのものをどういうふうに、それをカウントするかと。実際現実に存在している価値を無視するっていうのはおかしいんじゃないかということです。で、問題は QOL というのはオルタナティブインディケーター GDP に対してそういうものになるかと。もう一つはこの、SDGs が重要になってきましたので、その Land Use Transport Policies Better for Everyone ということで、それぞれの人たちにとっていいのか、全部グロスで OK じゃなくて、それぞれ違った人に対してこのプロジェクトがいいかどうかを見たいと。ということで、この QOL の変化というのを調べて、このインテグレートされた土地利用と交通の効果を見ましょうということであります。でまず最初にどんな方法かというのをお見せします。でこれはですね、ここに書いたようにヤングレディーとオールドマンっていうのはちょっとこれ絵を間違えましたが、この違った人がいますよと。でこの黄色いところに、今住んでますと。そうしたときにこのグリーンはですね、病院が自分のところになくて30分とか1時間遠いところにある。ショップは30分とか20分とか遠いところにある。でそうすると、自分のところで使えるメリット、このサービスのバリューっていうのがですね、減衰するわけですね。でこのところで住んでいた人の全部もらえる、享受できるバリューっていうのはアクセシブルバリューと呼んでまして、もともとここにある、例えば幼稚園がありました、キンダーガーデンがありましたと、これは 100% 利用できますよね。こういうものを全部足したものをアクセシブルバリューと言っています。でこれに対して、この、若い女の子とですね、年取った男のつもりですが、にとっては違った評価をするということですね。というのは、若い女の子にとってはこの病院っていうのはほとんど意味がないので、これぐらいにしか見えない、小さくしか見えない、ショップの価値は全部欲しいと、こういうふうになるわけですね。これを私はその人のパッシブドバリュー、パセプションのエフェクトと言ってますが、というものと考えています。でこれをイクエーションで書きますと、ごめんなさい、先ほどのこの、外にあるJ というゾーンにある M というサービスですね。メディカルサービスとかショッピングサービス。外のゾーンにあります。自分は I に住んでます。そうすると、この VMJ を全部もらえないので、 この減衰した分だけっていうので、これがアクセシブルバリューの AMIJ になります。で、こういうものを全部欲しいかどうかっていうのはそうじゃないですよって言いましたね。で、これは人によって K という自分のアトリビュート、その人の個人のアトリビュートによって M というサービスをどれぐらい欲しいかが違うということで、この MK の W っていうのが、この重みですね、ウェイトですね。で、これ全部足すと1になるんですが、でこれを重み付きで足し合わせたものを私は QOL とディファインしています。で、これは I のゾーン、I という場所に K という種類の人が住んだ時の QOL ですから、私と若いこの女性とでは値が違うわけですね。で、これがいいのはですね、これ全部足し合わせると、全部の K、人に足し合わせると、グロスナショナルハピネスとかグロスリージョナルハピネスになります。これはブータンの、マスとしてのトータルとしての GDP に変わるもの。それからもっといいのは、この K というグループ別にも計算できますから、年寄りに、エルダリーピープルにとっていいかとか、ヤングピープルにとっていいかとか、ローワーインカムピープルにとっていいかとか、こういうことができるということですね。はい、さて、それじゃあ、それをケーススタディで話をしていきましょう。南京とシンガポールの話です。これは南京ですね。で、ここでまず、これが南京市ですが、だいたいこれが70キロぐらいで、こっちが30キロぐらいですね。横が30キロぐらい。で、ここにメトロのラインがあります。で、メディカルサービスが、これ、病院がこれだけ、あります。で、都心にかなり固まってますね。で、これが先ほどのアクセシブルバリューという私が言いましたが、このアクセシブルバリューはですね、一体どうなってんのかということを見たいと思います。で、そうすると、これは existing value ですね。で、これがアクセシブルバリューになると、こんな格好になるんです。で、これですね。で、この鉄道の線路がここにありますけども、こんなふうになってですね、都市の真ん中は、アクセス、メディカルサービスにアクセスできますからいいんですが、そうじゃない人にとっては、この地下鉄の沿線に住んでいる人だけが OK で、そうじゃないところは非常に低いという、これがアクセシブルバリューですね。で、このアクセシブルバリューに対して、そのエイジとかジェンダーの差によって、これはシンガポール、南京との女性、男性、シンガポールの女性、男性としてますが、どれぐらいの重みかっていうのが人によって違うということが出てきます。例えば、このメディカルケアオポチュニティのところで一番下のところに行きますと、シンガポールの場合の方が、ハイヤーインカムの人が病院をたくさん欲しいという、こういうことになっています。はい。で、この値をジオグラフィカルにプロットすると、これが若い女性ですね。赤いところが高いです。QOL が高い。ここに住んだら高い。外に住んだら低いということです。これがミドルエイジの女性。それから、そのシニアな女性。それからこれは男性で、これは男性全体ですね。そんなことない。それから、その学歴によってどう違うかとかですね、ミドルスクールしか出てない人、ハイスクール出てる人、ユニバーシティ出てる人という、こういうふうに変わってきますし、ローインカムの人にとってのハピネスとか、ミドルインカム、ハイヤーインカムの人にとって違うというのが出るわけです。同じようなことをシンガポールについてもやりました。で、これは、これ上が女性、下が男性、左からヤング、ミドル、シニアとなりますね。で、女性にとってはですね、いろんな問題が何が大事かがあるんですが、このクライムレート、犯罪率っていうのが非常に重要だっていうのが出てきます。だから男の方はそうでもなくて、そのミドルエイジの男性はワーキングの、通勤のアクセシビリティが大事だって出てきます。それからごめんなさい、シニアな人たちにとっては男も女もですね、コミュニティライフが大事だと。遠いところへ通勤したいだけじゃなくて、そのコミュニティの中で生活が大事だとなっています。で、これを、マッピングします、同じように。で、これはヤングフィメールですね。からこれが、ヤングメール。ヤングメールの方が幸せなんですね、どういうわけか。からミドルエイジフィメールはものすごく幸せ。 からミドルエイジ面は全然幸せじゃなくて、これ多分都心のところのに住んでもあんまり幸せじゃないっていうのは、まあ、ワーコホリックであんまりショッピングに興味がないとか。からエイジドフィメール、でオールドフィメール、オールドメールって言うと、私なんかこのカテゴリーですが、私はシンガポールにマイグレートした方がいいってことになります。で、これをこんなふうに、高さと、この色は赤いところが QOL が高い。水色の、ディープ、ダークブルーのところはロー QOL ですね。で、そうすると、せっかく高い QOL のところが都心にあるんですが、あんまり住んでないんですね。で、これじゃもったいないということで、これをどうすればいいかと。で、シビルエンジニアだと、この、アンハッピーな人がたくさんいるところに、例えば、リングラインオフ MRT とかね、を作るとかですね。それから、いや、そうじゃなくて、私はコンパクトシティ派だという人がいたら、そうじゃなくて、同じお金を、この外の人に対してサブシディを与えると。なぜ住まないかというと、この都心は値段が高いから、コストが高いから住まないんです。そのコストを補助してあげると、まあ、何%の人かが、例えば半分とかが真ん中に来て、いい色になると。あるいは、これはまあランドユース、コンパクトシティポリシーですが、もう一つは土地利用ポリシーとしては、この外のところはそのサービスがないので、病院とかショップが都心にあればですね、そういうところがもしも病院が外にマイグレートしてくれれば、リムーブしてくれれば、こちらに補助金を上げると。同じバジェットでどれが一番エフェクティブかということができるということですね。はい、その次のケーススタディに行きます。これは、日本の名古屋の近くで、インフラストラクチャーがいいか、緑がいいかという、こういうことを検討します。で、これは、名古屋がありまして、これ名古屋が、まあ、230万人人口がありまして、ここがまあ中心都市で、ごめんなさい、名古屋は、どこだ、名古屋はこの辺りですね。ごめんなさい、名古屋はこの辺ですね。で、このメインラインで、このニュータウンの近くに降りるということですね。これは50年ぐらい前にできたニュータウンです。で、ここは実はその駅から降りたときにバスしかないので、これに対してですね、LRT を作ろうとのと、もう一つは同じお金で緑をプランティングしようということを考えます。で、その時に誰の価値をそれで調べるかということになるんですが、まあ、一つはこの名古屋メトロポリタンリージョンの、まあ、でクエスチョネアサーベイでウェイトを求めて、今の名古屋人、それからドレスデンとかドルトムントとか、まあ、ドイツなんかでも調査しましたので、ドレスデンの人と比べるとですね、例えばドレスデンの人はこのグリーンが名古屋の人よりもずっと大事だっていうのが出てくるわけです。これはどっちの人、どこに住んでる人とかによってこれだいぶ違うわけですね。ドイツ人はまあ緑が好きなんですね。で、これが結果ですが、これ現在の QOL で、すいません、これ色が反転してまして、赤いところがローで、グリーンのところが高いんですが、この下がですね、LRT シナリオでいきます。で、そうすると、それから同じお金でグリーンシナリオで行ったときにはですね、2025年に完成したとすると、このトータルのグロスナショナルハピネスはですね、緑だと 2%、LRT だと 15% しか15% も上がると。ところが、例えば2040年になると、この名古屋人はドレスデン人のようにすごく緑が好きになるとしましょう。そうすると、LRT の方はここからはもうむしろ下がる、価値が下がって、このグリーンの方が価値が上がると、こういうふうになって QOL が違ってくるわけですね。まあ、こんなふうなことができますと。それからハイスピードレールのイバリエーションにも使いました。で、これは、ムンバイ・アーメダバードで500キロですから、ちょうど日本の、東京、大阪と同じぐらいですが、まあ、人口もかなり大きいのですけども、 違うのは日本が新幹線をスタートした時はほとんどビジネスのために使ったんですね。だけどもこの今そのインドはそのビジネスだけじゃなくていろんなそのツーリズムとか、メディカルケアとかいろんなものに使う可能性が出てくるわけです。でそれで、これを逆に押しましたね。それで、調査をしましてアンケートを取るとですね、この先ほどのムンバイ、スーラ、アメダバード、スーラっていうのがまあ中くらいの都市で、これはまあ200、300万人ぐらいの都市ですね。ムンバイは大きくて全部入れると、まあ、2000万人近くなります。で、こちらは1500万人ぐらいですね、アメダバード。で、そうするとですね、例えばホスピタルなんていうのがですね、これアーメダバード、ムンバイ、スーラトの人によって違うのは、ホスピタルはこれムンバイの人は本当ホスピタル欲しがってるんですね。それから、例えば、コミューティングのところを見ると、これムンバイは大きな都市ですからコミュニティングがもっとちゃんとしてほしいと。ベターコミュニティングが望んでると。で、スーラの方は小さいですからあんまり望んでないとかですね、こういうふうに違った結果が出てきます。で、それを全部そのジオグラフィカルマッピングをすると、ごめんなさい。この左がウィズアウトの時、赤が QOL が高い。で、ブルーが低い。で、真ん中が with で、この引き算するとディファレンスということで、こういうところがこのむしろスーラとかこの近くが、と北の方ですね、ここがQOL が高くなってきて、同じそのムンバイから離れたところでも、ごめんなさい、ここがムンバイですね。これ、南側よりもスーラの南より北の方が伸びるんですが、これはなぜかというと、ローカルな鉄道等のですね、パブリックトランスポートがこちらの方がネットワークが整備されているわけです。で、その結果、何が出るかというと、例えば、その、これがいいかな、トラベルタイム、1時間について440ルピーということになります。で、これがだいたい日本円で400、だからこれが多分、3ユーロぐらいですね、これが。3ユーロぐらい。それから、このディレイを同じ1時間でも3倍、その価値があるというか、これがダメージがあるということになります。エアコンディショニングはまだそんなに大きくないですね。こんなふうにして、何をやれば、良くなるかが人によって違う、人っていうか、その、これは平均ですね、ここで。ただ、ハイヤーインカム、ミドルインカム、ローインカムによって違うというのは出てきます。ローインカムの場合だと、そのディレイが起こると、たくさんこのダメージが大きいと。で、どれぐらいのベネフィットになるかっていうのも計算したのはこのグラフでして、このホスピタルに行く価値、それからがブルーからグリーンのところはカルチュラルなトラベルですね。間はいろんなものがあります。カレッジ、トゥーリスト、ショップとかありますね。で、この今ので言うと、このハイヤーインカムの人にとっては時間価値も高いですので、この特にこのホスピタルのところの価値とかですね、カルチュラルのが高いと。ローインカムとかこうだと。で、これがですね、インドの経済が発展すると、その今はこれそれぞれその 100% ローインカムの場合とかやったんですが、この組み合わせが変わってくるわけですね。ローインカムがだんだん減っていって、ハイヤーインカムが増えてくると、将来的にこんなふうにベネフィットが増えますよという計算ができます。で、これ一番最後になるんですが、これをバンコクの大渋滞に適用したらどうかというので、私たちは QOL マースというのを提案しています。これデジタルサポートですね。で、バンコクは、カーオーナーシップがですね、東京と比べると所得が上がる前からすごく大きくなって、大渋滞になって、これは同じ私が、93年に撮った写真とまた今同じようになってきたんですね。で、ちょっとこう省きますが、その変極点があって、その車の台数の割には道路の、トータルレングスが少なくなってきて、そうするとこう下がってきて、あるところで、 トラベルタイムがポーンと跳ね上がるという、これを私はリミットモータリゼーションと言ってますが、こんなふうなことも。で、よくあるのは北欧で開発された MaaS を適用したらどうかっていうのがありますが、その MaaS は主として車をやめながらパブリックトランスポートにシフトしましょうということなんですが、パブリックトランスポートそのものももうフルなんですね。そうするとそのまま適用することは非常に困難だということです。で、何をやらなくちゃいけないと考えたかというと、実はこれはJICA ですね、ドイツでいうと GIZ ですねと、それからそのサイエンス&テクノロジー、オーガニゼーションのプロジェクトとして今バンコクで私がやってるんですが、3年前からやってます。で、一つはそのインフラストラクチャーは頑張って実は20年間で270キロの鉄道ができました。すごいんですよ。になるということです。もうちょっと。それからだけどもこれだけじゃ無理なので、今のように混んでるので、それで、そうするとディマンドサイド、サプライサイドだけはダメなんで、ディマンドサイドを考えなくちゃいけないとですね。で、フレキシブルなタイムだけじゃなくてプレイスも考えましょうということですね。それからニューノーマルも考え、これは最初は考えてなかったんで、3年前知らなかったから、だけども結果として非常にうまくなったと。で、どんなことかというと、朝起きます。で、5時に起きて6時ぐらいに出るかどうかを今決めて、皆さん今車に乗って出ちゃうんですね。車に乗って出ちゃうんですが、どうすればいいかってAI に聞きますということなんですね。で、そうするとこういう答えが出てくるんです。で、これは現在その現在のものは、ショーテストルートのガイダンスが車に乗ったら出てきますね。あるいは鉄道に乗るときも今ガイドが出ますが、だけどショーテストパスですね。時間の。そうじゃなくて、その何時に動くとどれぐらい混雑してるかっていうのがあって、それはマイナスの QOL なので、そういうのが全部カウントされていくということで、全部計算する。あるいはその場所で、そのステイしてたら、ホームにいたら会社よりも幸せだとかですね、そういうのが全部ショッピングしたらどんだけの QOL か、全部 QOL が出るような計算を今しています。もうこれ、詳しいのはやめますが。で、そして個人のこの1日の QOL のプロファイルとかセキュリティとか CO2 が出てきて、それに対してマーケットの方でどこの場所が混雑するかっていうのが出てくると、渋滞が出てくる。で、現在は家にいて、通勤して、そしてオフィスで仕事して、また通勤で帰って家に帰るということなんですが、この間にコーワーキングスペースとかね、そういうものを挟んだらいいんじゃないかということで、これを私のところのドクターの学生のチャーリー・ウィット・サルト君が計算した、いろいろテストしたんですが、今のままでいくと、このピークが2つ出るわけですね。で、これをフレキシブルワーキングにすると、時間は決めないで、非常に QOL が高いっていうか、空いた時に出ればよろしいってことにすると、緑の方に下がってくると。だから平準化されるわけ、イコライズされるわけですね。これ13倍違うのが、ピークとオフピークが違うのが今 5.5 倍までになります。から CO2 もこの28倍違ったのが5倍ぐらいになるということで、この QOL が 36% 伸びます。CO2 が 3% 減ります。で、そうすると QOL 割る divided by CO2 ということになると、This is Weizsäcker's factor がプラス 40%。で、this tangent is BAU flex time and flex time plus 5 times more co-working places then more comfortable. Then finally, I summarize. I have already told about happiness for person and for the nation, and then sufficiency indicator is very useful. And then this is also useful. This is prepared together with Juni Chan Sensei. So whether we can give equal opportunity in cities and rural areas without risks from disasters and ecosystems, and then remote working, and then teleconference, etc. So now this kind of QoL, not QoL only, QoL divided by cost, this is a QoL performance or sufficiency, in other words, sufficiency-based planning is better for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to keep the time very perfectly and very impressive contents. Later we have more comments later, and but then I will not take any question. Thank you, Professor Hayashi. Let's move to the next speaker, Dr. Takehita. If you are ready, please start. Okay, you have 10 minutes in total.
少々お待ちください。すいません、これで見えてますでしょうか。私の声聞こえてますでしょうか。はい、すいません、始めます。中部大学の竹下と申します。本日は先ほどの林先生よりお話がありました、その QoL アクセシビリティ法を使いまして、この手法をですね、運輸部門とか、交通インフラ整備や交通サービスの改善、それが、SDGs の達成にどう貢献しているかをどう分析するか、どう活用するかについてちょっとお話しさせていただこうかと思います。表紙が違ってた。すいません。ですね、皆さんご存知だと思いますけれども、SDGs、サスティナブルデベロップメントゴールズですね。と、2015年9月の国連サミットで、採択されました、2030年までに世界的に達成すべき国際目標となっております。SDGs はここにあるように17の目標と、それぞれに紐づいております、169のターゲットから構成されてまして、地球上のすべての人を誰一人取り残さない、ノーワンレフトビハインドを理念として掲げていると。でまた、それぞれの達成度合いを測る指標としまして、国連は SDG インディケーター、SDG グローバル指標というものを、それぞれのターゲットに定めています。でさて、運輸部門と SDGs の関係ですが、この図は、スロキャット、パートナーシップオンサスティナブルローカーボントランスポートというところが作りました、運輸部門が直接的に関連する SDGs を取り上げたものになります。ただし、これだけではなくですね、運輸部門は、その他の SDGs も間接的に貢献しているものもあります。例えば、その SDGs の2番なんかですと、市場アクセスを改善して農業生産性を向上させるですとか、そこを倍増させましょうとか、そういったものはまさに交通も関連していると言えます。あとはまた先ほどもお話ししたその国連の SDGs グローバル指標、これにも書いてあるんですけれども、例えば 3.6 の1ですと、交通死亡事故者数を減らしましょうですとか、9.1.1 ですね、こちらですか。は、これじゃないな。こっちです。9.1.2 ですね。では、色化貨物の輸送量で、SDGs の達成度を測りましょうといったことになっています。ですけど、この、運輸部門の SDGs の貢献では評価するにあたっては、まだまだ多くの課題があると考えています。ここでは3つ取り上げたいと思います。まず、その運輸部門の間接的な貢献度合いですね。先ほど話した、市場へのアクセスとか、そういったものに関しては、ちょっとSDGs グローバル指標では違ったもので評価されているということがあります。ただそういったところに行くためには、そういった場所に実際行かなきゃいけないんですけれども、そういったことは、グローバル指標では評価できていないと。あと2番目としては、まだ、直接的な、貢献を評価するものでも、データがなかったりですとか、手法が不在なものがまだまだあって、達成度の評価を困難にしている。でそして私が最大の課題かなと思っているのは、このグローバル指標ですけれども、とか他の指標でも結構、マクロレベルでの評価をしている点があります。なんで、国とか地域で見たら、SDGs を達成していたとしても、個々人や地域別、そういったところで見たら達成できていない、そういったことがあるかもしれません。それが可視化されないっていうところは課題かなと思いまして、それは特に誰一人取り残さない、ノーワンレフトビハインドという理念から離れたものになってしまっていると考えています。そこでこういった課題に対応しつつ、その運輸部門の SDGs の貢献度をどう評価するか、それを QoL アクセシビリティ法を拡張することを提案したいということになります。でまずはその QoL アクセシビリティ法とその SDGs の関係をここで整理していこうと思います。でこちらの図はちょっとQoL アクセシビリティ法を簡単に表したものになります。ちょっと林先生の話をかぶってしまいますけれども、QoL アクセシ法で QoL を算出するには、まず、いろんな地区にある既存の価値や機会といったもの、存在価値ですね。これを、交通の利便性、掛け合わせてアクセス可能価値を出します。でこのアクセス可能価値に、個々人が、価値に対して感じる重みを掛け合わせることで、 認識価値を得るんですけれども、この総和を QOL と呼んでいます。このそれぞれの段階と、SDGs の関係を見ていきたいと思います。でまず既存価値、ちょっと我々の言葉で言うと QOL 構成要素になるんですけれども、QOL アクセシビリティ法では、こういった5つの大きな項目とそれぞれ紐づく、いくつかの要素により評価しています。で、これらの要素はSDGs ターゲットを比べますと、多くのターゲットと関連していました。ちょっとたくさん関連があっちゃって見づらいものになって申し訳ないんですけれども、これにより運輸網の直接効果がある、例えばこういった 3.6 ですね。これじゃまたな。交通事故の削減ですとか、そういったものだけでは間接的なもの、ここに病院へのアクセスですとか、4.3、行動教育会へのアクセス、そういったものが、交通インフラ整備とかサービスの改善に通して、その価値にどれだけ享受できることが可能になるかということを通じて評価しようということになります。で、次に既存価値と交通利便性を掛け合わせられるアクセス可能価値なんですけれども、これまでの、プロジェクト評価方法で用いてきた費用便益分析なんですけれども、これは、経済発展によるそのインフラ整備、あるいは交通インフラ整備のさらなる経済発展、このループですね、のみを評価してきたということが言えます。しかし、交通インフラでは今後重要になってくるのは、それにより住民が何ができるようになったかという視点かなと。で道路ができて今まで行きづらかった町のお店に行ける、病院に行きやすくなる、新しい仕事に就けるといった、そういったことを評価することが求められています。つまり、交通プロジェクトを評価するだけとか、こちらの既存価値を整備したということを評価するだけじゃなくて、ある地域にある価値をその交通の改善とか、立地によって、どれだけ多くの人が享受できるようになったか、どれだけシェアできるようになったかということに変えていく、それがまずアクセス可能価値ということに言います。で、このアクセス可能価値なんですけれども、その個々人の価値に対する思いを掛け合わせることで、この認識価値というものを出します。でアクセス可能価値というのは、地域間の交通利便性とそこにある価値の魅力の掛け算で決まるもので、ある地域においては一定の値となると。しかし、その価値がどれだけ重要になるかっていうのは、人によって異なりまして、例えば、こういったこの図のように、ある機械のアクセス可能価値が、60分から30分になって、向上したとしましょうと。しかし、この1番、貧困度ですね。例えば、ここ、収入とした場合に、金持ちの B さんはそんなに重みが多くなくて、お金がない A さんは価値が高いと。こうなった場合には、認知する価値っていうのは、B さんの方はあまり改善しなくて、A さんはすごい改善する。あるいは男女間でこのような差があった場合に関しては、男性の方が、価値が高く置いてますので、QOL は高く改善されるというような結果になります。つまり、改めてこのアクセシビリティ法なんですけれども、このように各段階でもすでにいくつかの SDGs の要素を取り込んでいるものになっています。例えばこういった、存在価値で表されるようなもの、それに、交通の利便性、SDGs の9番とか11番が特に関連してきますが、これでアクセシブルバリューを出した後に、このウェイト、特に1、2、3、4、5と言われるような人間に関係しているようなところに関しては、特にウェイトに関連してきて、それが認識価値として現れて、これは地域間とか個人差で見れますので、公平性の評価にも使えるということになります。ちょっと時間をしているので、ケーススタディを飛ばしていこうかと思うんですけれども、これ、高速道路を使ったものを介してどう解釈できるかというのを簡単に説明していこうかと思います。で、対象地域は山梨県と静岡県を結ぶ中部横断高速自動車道で、こちらがその位置、こちらが QOL の改善効果です。で、詳しいことに関しましては、この次のプレゼンターの森田さんに発表していただきますので、この結果をどう SDGs で解釈できるかということを説明していこうかと思います。で、こちらは静岡県と山梨県を比較したものになります。こちらがその割合、こちらが貨幣換算したものですけれども、山梨県はいろんな SDGs の改善に貢献したかなと言える一方で、静岡県は SDGs 11番しか、貢献していないと。で、一方で貨幣換算しますと、山梨県に関しては、すごい大きな値になっているんですが、静岡県は小さいと。でこれは静岡県が悪かったということではなくて、もともと静岡県は交通利便性がいい県ですので、山梨県はこれによって、地方間格差がなくなったというような解釈ができるかなとか、あとは、取得格差ですね。取得別で見る。これは1番とか2番、貧困度とか、飢餓とかに関係すると思うんですけれども、特に相和で見ますと、低所得者の方が高所得者に比べて、QOL の改善度が低いという結果が出てます。なので逆にこれは、 このインフラ整備によって、QOL の格差が大きくなっちゃっているというような解釈もできるのかなと考えています。で、こちらは男女間で見た場合なんですけれども、ちょっとこちらも割合で見ては、あまり差はないんですけれども、総和で見ますと、女性の方が大きくなってますので、これは、この中部横断自動車道は、QOL の男女格差を小さくしたのかなということは言えるかと思います。ちょっと時間がなくなってきたんですが、で、ここから面白いのが、これ、地域別でその男女間の、比を見てみた、要は女性の QOL を男性で割ったもので見ると、多くのところで女性が QOL 高まってるんですけれども、こういった地域、ここの黒で塗った地域は、男性の方が高まっているという珍しい地域なんですね。なので、こういったところに関しては、もしかしたら追加的な政策といったものが必要になってくるんじゃないかというふうなことが、こういったこの分析で見えてきます。で、最後にまとめですけれども、ここで QOL アクセシビリティを使いまして、どうその SDGs の貢献度を評価するかということをちょっと提案させていただきましたと。この手法、特にいろんな属性ですとか、いろんな地域で評価できますんで、いろんな SDGs のいろんな視点から評価ができるといったところが最大の特徴であり、また、ノーワンレフトビハインドといった理念の、実現の、評価する手法であるかなということが考えております。以上で発表を終わります。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sorry for pushing. And thank you, Dr. Takeshita. Next, Dr. Morida will give a similar talk, but from different angle. Could you please start? So please make a yes slideshow.
よろしくお願いいたします。
Okay.
はい、大日本コンサルタントの森田と申します。私の方からは、本日のテーマであります、道路事業の整備効果という視点から、日本の道路事業の整備効果に、先ほど林先生、竹下先生からご紹介いただいた、方法論を適用した場合のケーススタディのご紹介をしたいというふうに思っております。高速道路と街路という、かなり、スケールの異なる2つの事業への適用事例の紹介になります。まずこちらの方ですけども、先ほど八尾様の方から、お話しいただいた通りだと思っておりますけども、日本では、1万4000キロの、道路の、整備が計画をされております。で、現在のところ、その8割程度が整備完了しておりまして、大都市圏を結ぶような主要な幹線道路というのはすでに整備が、終わっているという状況でございます。で、現在はこう都心部の環状路線であるとか、先ほどリダンダンシーの話が出ましたけども、いわゆるダブルネットワーク、こうしたような路線が、整備の主となっておりまして、単に速達性、早く着けばいいというものから災害であるとか地域間の、格差の是正信頼性といったさまざまな効果が、求められつつあるというのが現状でございます。合わせて、こちらの方も昨年国土交通省より提示をされました、2040年の道路のビジョンの、イメージパースをいくつか、提示をしております。下にあります通り、こういったような新しいモビリティの台頭であるとか、あとは都市部の中でのですね、歩行者であるとか自転車への、交通の改善と、そういったような視点から、道路自体に求められるものが、単に自動車の速達性というものだけではなくて、幅広い、効果、面的効果というものが、求められつつあるというものでございます。こうして見てみますと、道路と一口に言いましても、当然その、階級ですね、高速道路から幹線道路、そして、都市内の街路、ストリートといったようなところに関して、単に自動車だけではなくて自転車や歩行者、あるいは、都市内に関してはパブリックスペースとしての価値も、求められつつあるという状況でございます。こうした役割をそれぞれ包括的に評価してあげるという仕組みが、今求められているということもありますので、この適用として、今回、QOL を適用した場合の一つの事例をご紹介したいというふうに思っております。先ほど林先生の方から、丁寧にご説明の、ありました通り、QOL というのは、たくさんのですね、生活の質としての価値を、統合して評価するモデルでございます。ただこうした中で、先ほど、アクセシブルバブルということもありましたけども、当然この移動にはですね、車を使ったり、徒歩を使ったり、さまざまな、交通手段を使うということがございます。で、当然交通手段の中にもですね、運転しやすい道路もあれば、運転しにくい道路もある、渋滞に巻き込まれやすい道路もあれば、渋滞に、合わない道路もあるといったようなことで、こうした、移動の質自体も、QOL の一部として問われてきます。合わせて歩行環境も同様でして、歩きやす すい道、歩きにくい道、安全な道、危険な道、それぞれございますので、こうしたものを、評価の中に組み入れるということを、今回試験的に実施をしております。はい、こちらの方が、先ほど林先生の方で提示されていただいたような、指標の、一部になってございますけれども、QOL 指標の一覧ということで、今回のケーススタディでは、5の、5つの分野、合わせて15、プラス、いくつかの、施設へのアクセスを考慮した、指標を、提示をしております。また、こうした中で、特に運転しやすさとしては、5つの指標ですね。時間、所要時間はもちろんのこと、時間の信頼性、あとは事故のリスク、そして、信号の密度や、通行料金といった運転のしやすさ、抵抗といった部分を考慮しております。また、歩きやすさにつきましては、歩道の幅、日陰の数、ベンチなどの休憩施設、緑の程度といったような、快適性、利便性、そして安全性の視点から、こうしたものも、同時並行して評価できるような枠組みを検討しました。はい、でこれらの指標を用いまして、今回、道路事業の整備効果の評価をケーススタディを実施をしております。まず、高速道路の、事業評価への適用事例ということで、先ほど竹下さんの、方から、ご紹介いただきました中部横断自動車道でのケーススタディを、提示、しております。で中部横断自動車道は、これ、絵の右側ですね、に東京、絵の左側に名古屋という大都市圏を結ぶちょうど間の静岡市という中核市ですね、政令指定都市100万人都市と、あとは北側の山側の甲府市という人口が40万人程度の都市を結ぶような路線の高速道路の区間でございます。現在、整備が進められているエリアでございますけれども、ちょうどこの間が中山間のエリアとなっておりまして、いくつかいろんな集落が張り付いているということで、中規模な地方都市間を結ぶ高速道路の事例でございます。まず、実証するにあたって、他の事業評価にも使えるように、日本全国で約8000件程度のデータを取得して、SP 調査によって、価値観、先ほど林先生がご紹介いただいたような価値観の、評価結果を得ました。例えば、あれですね、買い物先への、アクセス時間に対する価値であれば、高齢者の方が高く、価値を持っているとか、あるいは、若年層だけで見ますと、病院よりも駅へのアクセスの方が価値が高く、見込んでいるといったような、先ほど先生がご紹介いただいたような、年代別の比較とか、あるいは、目的別の時間価値の違いといったものがこうしたデータで確認をできています。また、運転しやすさに対する価値観についても、同様に、年代、所得等々別に、どういう違いがあるかといったようなことを、見ております。例えば女性であれば、単純に所要時間よりも時間の信頼性や、事故のリスク等を高く見ているとか、そういったような傾向が見て取れております。また、料金でですね、時間価値を見たところ、国土交通省さんが、マニュアルで示されている時間価値と、ほぼ同等の、データになっておりますので、アンケートの SP 調査ですと、少し、こうした単価の、価値観の、誤差が出やすいところですけども、今回の調査結果からは、ほぼほぼ、似た、値が出てきそうだということが確認取れております。この、価値観のデータを用いまして、今回高速道路が整備された場合と、されなかった場合、あるいは部分的にされた場合といったものの比較をしております。左側の絵がすべての、路線が整備された場合の、QOL 値の変化を示したものになっております。これまで、高速道路が通ってなかった、特にこの中山間のエリアですね、こうしたところ、は、通常病院等の施設も、都市部に頼っている傾向がありますので、非常に、QOL の、増分が大きくなっているという傾向が、絵として確認できております。で内訳を見てみますと、先ほどの全線開通の方が当然部分的に開通した場合よりも大きく効果が、足し算した以上にこう出てくるといったところがございます。でエリア別に、効果の内訳を見てみますと、山梨と比較的にちょっと人口規模が、小さいこの山間部の、地方都市の方は病院であったり、あるいは、空港であったりといったようなアクセスの価値が高まっているのに対して、海側の静岡に関してはこうした、避暑地へのレジャーですね、こうしたところへの、効果といったものがほぼ 100% ということで、こうしたところのアクセスの高い価値が、見て取れるという状況でございます。効果別にちょっと絵にをしてみますと、左側が病院へのアクセス価値で、こちらの方を見ますと、先ほど、見たほぼ中山間のエリアですね、こうした間のエリアでの効果が分布していることが確認できます。一方で、レジャースポット、観光施設への利便性の向上効果を見ますと、南側の 静岡市からのアクセス価値が高まっているということで、こうした効果の中身によって分布がどう異なるかといったところが確認できるといったところがございます。こうしたところですね、本来国土交通省さんで示している中部、横断の、そもそもの事業の目的であるとか、事業効果の、定性的な、紹介資料であるとか、こうしたところと、一致しているという傾向もありますので、こうしたところを定量的に示せるといった部分で、アカウンタビリティの向上が見て取れるのではないかというふうに考えてございます。時間なくなってきましたけども、もう一つはストリートデザインということで、街路の再配分のものに先ほどの歩きやすさの部分の評価を適用した場合の事例を簡単にご紹介したいと思います。こちらは松山市という人口が、20、30万人ぐらいですかね、の規模の、都市部の、駅の直結した、エリアの、街路再配分の事例になっております。道路のもともとですね、3車線と真ん中に LRT が、路面電車が通っていた、道路でございますけども、各2車線ずつを潰して歩行環境に戻して、街路の、歩きやすさを向上したという整備の事例でございます。先ほどの、歩きやすさの指標等を用いた場合において、整備前後で、どういう効果が、良くなったかといったところを分析したものです。歩道であるとか、あるいは、セーフティーの、安全性の装置、そして、照明ですね、安全性にかかる照明の、部分とかっていったところで、歩きやすさの価値が向上したといったようなところがアンケートと、評価の結果から、見て取れるというものでございます。こちらの方が、事業の評価としましては、だいたい年間、1億から2億といったような、事業効果が、確認できるということもありまして、今回、この事業自体がだいたい10億ぐらいですかね、かかっておりますので、こうしたところを、ある程度何年で回収できるかといったところに、定量的な分析として活用できる可能性があるというふうに考えてございます。最後すいません、ちょっと時間がないので割愛しますけども、課題等もございますし、確認できる効果といったところもたくさんあるというふうに考えております。こうしたところをですね、道路の整備効果の、評価の中で、うまく活用できるといったところの可能性も見て取れたというふうに考えております。私のプレゼンからは、以上になります。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much for keeping the time. And the last application for Professor Hayashi's QL approach is to look at the effects of smart shrink by Professor Kachi from Toyo University. If you're ready, please start.
はい、張先生、ご紹介ありがとうございます。東洋大学の梶です。私の方からは、Application of Individual QL-Based Approach to Evaluate of Smart Shrinkage ですけど、これまで、林先生がお話ししてきた、QOL の考え方に基づく評価法を、スマートシュリンクに適用した例について紹介させていただきたいと思います。でまず最初になんですけど、私の理解では日本ですと、コンパクトシティとか、スマートシュリンク、都市縮体という政策を考えるときに、都市部では、立地的成果計画、ロケーションオプティミゼーションプランというものが検討、実際に進められていて、一方で中山間地とか離島においては、小さな拠点を形成していくということが進められているかと思います。本日のプレゼンテーションでは、このうち、中山間地、離島に着目した、小さな拠点形成についての、事例を紹介したいと思います。まず最初に小さな拠点形成ですが、この右側の図が小さな拠点形成のイメージを示したものです。小さな拠点の形成っていうのは、中山間地、離島で人口が減少していく中で、もともと例えば3000人いた地域で、都市施設が300あった。で、3000人が1000人に3分の1になったとしたら、普通に考えれば施設も、300、元のまま維持していくことは難しくて、人口規模に合わせて、施設数も減らしていく必要があります。で、そのために、小さな拠点形成っていうのでは、その町の中に小さな拠点というものを作って、そこに、日常生活に必要な、生活サービス施設を、集約していく。そして、その、サービス施設が立地している拠点とその周辺の集落を公共交通で結んでいくことによって、 サービス施設を維持しながら、その地域の持続的な発展を図っていくという考え方です。で、ここで計算している中では、そのサービス施設を集約することに維持していくことの効果を QOL という考え方に基づいて評価し、プラスアルファ、日本の中山間地とかでは土砂災害危険地区とか災害に対して危険な地域がありますので、そういう災害に対する安全性を合わせて確保していくことによる効果を評価しているというものです。で、ここで計算している事例はすごくシンプルです。一つは左側の方、小さな拠点に生活サービス施設を集約する。もう一つは、右側の方ですが、こちらは、災害に危険なところに住んでいる人は安全なところに。で、生活の質が低いところに住んでいる人は生活の質が高いところに移転する。そういった政策の組み合わせです。これを3つのシナリオを準備して評価するというものです。1つ目のシナリオは何もしないシナリオです。2つ目のシナリオは生活サービス施設を拠点に集約するというシナリオ。3つ目のシナリオは、サービス施設の集約に加えて居住地の集約も行うというのが3つ目のシナリオになります。で、こちらの表が、この、シナリオで分析するベネフィットの部分とコストの部分です。で、ベネフィットの部分で、重要なのは、これまで、話に出てきた QOL の話です。QOL をこのベネフィット、住んでいる人のベネフィットとして、取り込んでいるということです。あと、先ほど話した災害についての、ところですね。災害に危険なところにそのまま住み続けると、災害が起きた後に災害復旧をする費用がかかるのに対して、危険なところに住むのをやめると、長期的に見ると、災害復旧費用が削減できるといったようなことです。で、コストとしては、インフラの維持コストとか、あと、ここでは居住地の移転等を行うので、そういう移転にかかるコスト等を考えています。で、こういうものを考えて、ここでは評価期間が30年で、便益と費用の比較をしています。で、QOL についてなんですが、QOL の、根本的なベーシックなところの考え方は、同じです。こちらはどちらかというと、林先生が紹介されたアクセシビリティ QOL 法で紹介されたものの少し簡易版を適用していると、見ていただければと思います。ここの式に書いてあるように、基本的には個人が持っている価値観、それに、この LPS って書いてあるのは、生活環境の物理的な部分、計測できるもの、こういう重みと、生活環境の物理量を掛け合わせて評価するのが QOL です。で、ポイントとしてはこのウェイトの部分ですね。価値観が、個人によって異なるということです。この辺をきちんと組み込んでいるという点です。で、次のこのスライドは、この事例で、計算をした、九州の長崎県にある壱岐市という、島です。で、左側の図の緑色が人口分布を示していて、この、壱岐市はもともと4つの町があって、それが合併したできた市になります。で、それぞれのもともとの拠点のところに都市施設等が集まっているような状況です。で、右側の方は、このオレンジ色のところが土砂災害危険地域です。で、次のこちらの図は、小さな拠点形成を考える上で、17の地区に分けています。そして、この赤枠で囲った部分が、小さな拠点になる部分。で、同じ色をしているところが、その拠点になるところが最寄りとなる地域になります。最初のこの例は、何もしなかった場合の QOL の変化です。左側は2010年度、最初の時点での QOL の分布を示しています。緑色がプラスで、赤色がマイナスの地域です。で、これが何もしないでおいて、2010年から2040年になっていくと、ほとんどの地域で QOL が低下、赤色。 になってきます。で、特に南のところで小さくなっています。次にこちらは、都市施設の集約だけを行った場合のシナリオで、ここでは、2の地域は赤色でマイナスなんですが、それぞれ、緑色の地域が出てきています。で、右側の方は、この30年間で便益から費用を引いたものですね。純便益の累積値を見たもので、コスト、この、小さな拠点を形成するために施設集約とかをやっていく上で、お金を考えるとプラスは出てきていないと。上の方で少しプラスで出ていますが、赤色のところはマイナスなので、多くの地域でマイナスになっているという状況です。で、これに対して、さらに施設集約だけではなくて、居住地の集約をすると、災害危険地区から動くことになるので、その分のプラス。あと、拠点に近くなることによる利便性の増加とかがあり、その結果、QOL そのものについては多くの地域でプラスになります。で、コストについても、先ほどですと、住まなくなることによるインフラ維持コストの削減であったり、災害リスクの軽減による、災害復旧費用の削減という点でも、コストの面でプラスが出てきて、いくつかの地域を残してプラスになってきます。そして、もう一つは、国の補助金等で、想定できるものを入れた場合にどこまでコスト面でプラスにできるかというものを計算したものがこちらになります。こちらを見ると、この一つ3っていう地区だけはまだマイナスなんですが、それぞれのその他の地域ではプラスが見込めるようになってきています。という計算結果が出ています。最後にまとめますと、今回のこの研究では、この事例の、計算では、まず、小さな拠点になり得る地区の選定を行った上で、3つのシナリオですね。何もしなかった場合、サービス施設、生活サービス施設を集約した場合、さらに3つ目のシナリオとしては、居住地の移転も行った場合、それぞれの効果について分析してきました。このような形で、交通だけでなくて、こちらは土地利用ですね。特に、スマートシュリンク、コンパクトシティといったことに QOL の方法を適用した場合のケースをご紹介させていただきました。はい、発表は以上です。ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. As a last moment, we were happy to welcome Dr. James Lisa to give a comment on the 4 speakers. James, are you ready?
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. What I particularly liked is that quality of life could be utilized in many different scenarios. You looked at some mega cities, and in the last one, we saw that right down to local communities. So it demonstrates that the approach can be utilized in many different environments. Let me try and go through each of those and then put a position from Asian Development Bank, being a development organization, and looking at some of these broader impacts, but also localizing those within the developing member countries of Asia and the Pacific. And I'll finish off with one key component that is required to make such an assessment, like any assessment, suitable. But I think there are solutions to that, and they're emerging as we speak, sort of day by day. Now, Professor Hayashi, he mentioned one thing that I found very interesting, which was the monetization of various benefits. About 10 years ago within ADB, we looked at a broader assessment portfolio, similar to the ones we heard at the beginning of this event, being utilized in Europe, the Sustainable Transport Appraisal Rating, which used some quantitative and qualitative assessments on economic, social, environmental, and risk project implementation, project cost. So it gets back to some of the optimism bias as well that we heard about. Another interesting point that's sort of linked to that is that people are very different. What was shown in terms of what they may need and how that can be assessed is of great importance. And I think throughout the presentations, it was shown that age, gender, was highlighted. From a development organization's perspective, I would also wonder on the disposable income dimension of this as well, because if we're looking at what is important for people's qualities of life, there are many different dimensions. Certainly, as was demonstrated, once you get older, you have different priorities. Males, females have different priorities. From a development perspective, particularly in a lot of the urban areas or the rural areas, in the urban areas, many of the public transport users are captive users. They have no choice. It's not, shall I leave my car at home and take public transport today? They have no option. Their only option is walking for several hours or using very poor public transport systems. So it's a very important point. And I do also believe there's an awful lot of push for different types of alleged solutions from urban transport, whether this is shared bicycles, shared scooters in some of these areas. While they play parts in a transport system, they're not going to provide the solution. It will be a niche use in certain areas, and not everyone would want to use a scooter. So we must provide a full range of transport systems and services that are suitable for the whole range of the population. In terms of Dr. Takahashi-sata, he was mentioning SDGs. Now, one interesting point here is at what scale. What we're finding within our assistance, we have been providing a lot of physical infrastructure. So we build 200 kilometers of railway or upgrade 200 kilometers of road. Once we start to look at the SDGs at a scale where it's going to matter, we need to understand what's happening at a network impact if we are meant to see any significant improvements in countries meeting those SDGs, or indeed the Paris Agreement on climate change. For example, rural connectivity, if we're looking at who lives within 2 kilometers of an all-season road, we need to look at the entire road network and manage that. Providing physical infrastructure or assessment of a one-off piece of infrastructure, it can have an impact, but is it going to have the impact network-wide? Road safety and another SDG, similarly, if we build safe roads and we try our best to incorporate safe systems around those roads, safe vehicles, vulnerable road users, post-crash care, all of those components, speed, safe helmet wearing, seatbelt wearing, can we have an impact on the hundreds of thousands of kilometers of roads as opposed to the 100 kilometers of road of that piece of infrastructure? So I think the scale is very important, and when we're looking at the evaluation, when particularly in SDGs and the quality of life that people or the governments would put on those. Interesting presentation, Dr. Morita, on the walkability indicator. This is something that we have utilized quite a lot within ADB, particularly when we were looking at urban livability, and one of our priority areas under the new Asian Development Bank strategy is talking about livable cities. So the walkability range of transport options and solutions is very important. Again, disaggregating the information by age, gender is very useful in this. One thing I do wonder on that is, how are the priorities set? Was there a stated preference or a stated intention exercise to look at what would be a priority within those areas? And from my previous work experience, as was said right at the beginning, we started off with vehicle operating costs, values of time. Then when I was working in the UK, we were looking at a lot of noise impacts, visual intrusion, particularly for grade separated junctions. Then we moved to air quality, and now we're looking at the SDGs and climate change. There is, one thing is certain, is that the dimensions and the agendas will change and evolve over time. So to try and identify what is important for a high quality of life now may change, and as was shown by all the presentations, it does vary depending your gender or your age. And I would add to that, from the development perspective, your incomes as well. On the externalities, it was highlighted as well what some of those economic externalities, and it reminded me within transport, how do we quantify, measure some of the negative externalities, the road safety, the air pollution, the climate change contributions. So that those externalities, whether it's within the quality of life or in terms of the street dimensions and how we monetize those or value those, or can be used within some of the other areas within transport. And it's an area we've been trying to address, but obviously struggling given the ability to monitor and measure many of these things. Professor Kachi on connectivity, it reminded me a little bit of the sort of discussions on transit-orientated development, but that's usually around megacities, but this was in a smaller community, sort of bringing those facilities together, and it somewhat along that Singapore example that was given, how you look at replicating those village communities that creates that quality of life, but within a city context. And that's what Singapore is always highlighted as being a very important city in terms of its land use and its accessibility, not just to the city center, but to the facilities and services around those areas. As you highlighted in your smaller communities, how do you conglomerate those, the particular facilities that are required at a very small level applies just as much to the large cities such as Singapore. Now, I have mentioned that the dynamics of this changes over time, and we do need to be mindful of that, and therefore it won't be static. We'll have to incorporate new areas as well. But my final point was what underpins all of this, and that is data. Any such model is very data hungry. One thing we find across developing Asia and the Pacific is that data is missing in almost all cases. And if it is there, it's not disaggregated to the level that we would require. This has been an issue in terms of how we undertake the very basic economic analysis. Do we know what the vehicle operating costs are? Because do we understand exactly what the vehicle mix might be like? Are we able to measure the emissions? Do we know how many diesel vehicles there are or gasoline vehicles if we're looking at particulate matter or such? However, having said that, or vehicle kilometers travel, whatever it may be, but having said that, I believe now with new technologies able to access data in a very different way than we had in the past. When I was studying transport, we stood at the side of the road and we had clickers and we counted vehicles. That is not the case anymore. We use satellite imaging. We use little widgets within car engines to assess what emissions and that use may be. We are getting it to a point where we could use data in almost real time to understand what people's choices are and how they make those choices. So I really enjoyed this session. I think the quality of life is a great indicator. It's got many different usage across a range of different cities, but key to this is getting the data and sensible data at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. Personally, I really hoping to ask all speakers to give some feedback, answer, but maybe no time, right? So
yeah, we don't have time now, but I have a suggestion.
Okay.
This comment from Jamie Leather, thank you very much. This has been an excellent, not only a summary, but also a very important focus that we can touch on, how quality of life will shake up or will make us revisit the evaluation of projects and the traditional method that we have used for cost-benefit analysis. And the second and the final point that Jamie Leather made is about the availability of data. Often models suffered from lack of data, particularly in developing countries. But now we have data that is available. Perhaps maybe too much data that is available. But to provide now the new thinking, fortunately or unfortunately, transport planners have been actually the most affected by COVID in a way, because we have not been able to place any policies except stay at home. And that is also not working because all our assumptions of transport helping economy is now being challenged because without transport, economy cannot work. So we kind of stuck. So maybe this is a time to discuss. I know Professor Juni Zhang has done some excellent research on what perceptions people have regarding transport after COVID. So what is the post-COVID era transport policy? Over to you, Professor Zhang. 7 minutes for you. After that, we'll have fire chat round. Everybody, all the panelists who spoke in the first round, and then Professor Hayashi representing our speakers in the second round, and then also we'll invite Jamie Leather to be part of us. Go ahead, Professor Zhang.
Okay, so you already started chairing the last session. Thank you very much. And thank you for introducing me. And today I'm very happy, really, as I mentioned, I learned a lot from, I tried to write a lot of comments. So today, because we have very limited time, I will emphasize the quality of life. Actually, when I heard about the term evaluations, I remember my time when I worked as consultant in Tokyo for some years, more than 15 years ago. And I did a lot of work on cost-benefit analysis, and also remember to apply those some difficult model to evaluate, to try to meet the requirement from Ministry of Transport and other, let's say, municipality to help them to assess different transport project. So my first point is about the COVID-19. I think everybody, I think my time starts from maybe too earlier. So everybody already experienced, we are not talking about the, let's say, video conference. And I think we're hoping you enjoying. Actually, the COVID-19 really bring a lot of changes. So I think some people feel happier because they can stay at home to work. And some people feel really unhappy because they may lost their job because of the, let's say, the restricted, let's say, accessibility to job opportunities, okay? And we really see some people really missing travel because I think I want to meet each other with a face-to-face communication. So this is the changes. And we should also see a lot of other changes, like we're talking about the effects of transport projects on the improvements of quality of environments. But if you're looking at the COVID-19 as a pandemic, we see a lot of, let's say, reduction without any investment on huge amount of infrastructure. We see the reduction of emissions, or because of the changes in behavior. So behavior changes is quite important. We should need such ideas to emphasize behavior change in policy making in future. And talking about the, let's say, the evaluation for project, I think existing approach, the widely applied approach emphasizes money, okay? Because once we construct some roads, we expected some time saving, then those time saving bring some benefits eventually to some job, let's say, opportunity and market accessibility, economic activity, let's say, revitalization, for example. So all because of the money. So, but unfortunately, we know from scientific evidence, money does not equal to quality of life. Okay, because we have some so-called happy, let's say, poor and unhappy rich. This is very common findings. And we see some, let's say, once we improve, let's say, all transport projects or even spatial planning, we can see, yes, that will bring benefits to our society, but we should see some unequal education of benefits. I think in that sense, Professor Hayashi's quality of life approach emphasized, let's say, spatial and individual variation for the benefits from the projects. Let's say I like this approach very much. And I think behind this approach, we have some two, maybe, let's say, different society, so which we are emphasizing more than others. One is called a market-oriented society. It emphasizes the competition, speed. The other side, we talk about the life-oriented market, society. So I emphasize the balance, life and, say, job-life balance, or work-life balance, or slow life. Right? We're talking about, let's say, a lot of less density, but more space. But with complex cities, it's sort of very dense, with like maybe. So we have different, let's say, aspects for such a, let's say, consideration. And for the quality of life itself, I think we really need to as I mentioned, I really like this idea, especially Professor Hayashi and his team propose a very comprehensive framework, especially they can quantify the effects of project in terms of the quality of life and emphasizing the, let's say, heterogeneous benefits and spatial, variation of benefits, and also, let's say, different type of, let's say, education we can find from his proposal and also the applications. But then my question is that we know quality of life, but actually when we talk about the quality of life, the different people or people from different disciplines talking from different language. We don't have the same language. Give you example. I think you may know the Professor Winhofen, Ruth Winhofen. He is my friends and also my respected professors, supervisor, and he is so-called, let's say, godfather of happiness studies. I really like his research. He proposed that, for example, quality of life has 4 dimensions. Okay, why 4 dimensions? The first, of course, internal, external. So how you feel in your mind, that's yourself. But let's say if you look at your, let's say you are out of your home, you have a beautiful park and a very accessible road. So those, let's say, good environments, you can feel, you can perceive some quality, right? It's got internal and external. It's very different. And when we talk about, let's say, the quality of life, say, are you talking about, for example, when we assess the transport project benefits, are we talking about, say, how much the transport project bring more chances for people to go to different places, to access the job, to accept, let's say, in a better way to hospital, to other, let's say, urban facility? There's a chance. So you can build some good road for bicycle, expecting that people can have a more healthier life. But if you don't do exercise, you don't use bicycle to use the bicycle lane, no benefits. That means that we have one more dimension, it's called life results, right? So life results different from life chances. I think maybe transport projects or spatial planning provide some opportunities for people, but how people make the opportunity, different story. Then what we evaluate over, let's say, project. That's another, let's say, key point. I'm hoping somebody, especially from Professor Hayashi's team and also as an expert to talk give me some advice. Okay.
Thank you.
And my last point.
Please.
My last point is about, because of the connection between our transport and our life. My last, let's say, maybe question to everybody: can we use transport budget to invest, say, how to improve people's activity? Say how to improve, say, the local cities, because of some road bring young people out, migrate from local city to big city. Can we use the money in transport to improve the local city environment, to attract more people to come back? As this is my let's say, thinking, and also some maybe comments in general. Hope I can bring some ideas for you to discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. I think you've made interesting comments as well as asked a very provocative question. So let's go back to our panelists who were speakers in the first session. We can start in any order. Whoever wishes to speak first, maybe if you a show of hands, or I can call you on. So let me start with Professor Roger Wickerman, please.
Yeah, there's so many ideas, I think, rushing through my head in terms of this. First of all, on the quality of life issues, is the extent to which it really is different from what we've been doing for a long time. It just bringing in different dimensions of things. And I think it's important to remember that cost-benefit analysis is not, strictly speaking, about measuring GDP. It's about measuring welfare. And I think the need to think about how welfare relates to quality of life rather than how quality of life relates to GDP is important with that. But I think the more general point I'd like to make is about the issues that are involved in this post-COVID situation, assuming that we are moving towards post-COVID. I don't think it's going to be a simple solution. I think it's going to complicate the nature of transport demand, that people won't sort of either go back to how they always behaved or stay in the sort of lockdown type situation of working from home and doing everything online. I think it's going to create things which change the way that people use transport. And I think that's something that we've got to be very alert to in this, whether that's because people will go to the office 3 days a week rather than 5 days a week, whether they will go to the office outside traditional peak hours or not, and how they respond to that. So, for example, fear has been built up that traveling on public transport is terribly, terribly dangerous, and so you mustn't do it. Whereas, in fact, all of the objective evidence is that traveling on public transport is not terribly dangerous, that there has been very little evidence of the virus resting on surfaces in transport, or that there has been transmission through droplets in the air on public transport, because public transport is actually pretty clean compared with the other things that people do. So I think it's that change of attitude in terms of that is important. And the final point is that, of course, the great encouragement was don't use public transport, don't drive your car, cycle or walk. Well, our cities have not been built in most cases for cycling and walking. And so we've got pop-up cycle lanes all over the place, which are annoying everybody. We've got, can people actually walk the distances that are involved with this? I mean, I live in a lovely rural area and I see that people are walking and cycling, including myself, all the time. And that's very nice. But in a major city, then it's not possible. How long will it take to redesign cities and redesign people's brains to think about how they respond to this? And I think in terms of that, we've also got to think very clearly about how we can model transport that goes in the future. So there are huge numbers of challenges, I think, that we face in this. Thank you. We just scratched the surface, I think, this morning. Of Thank you.
I think you've touched a range of topics. So let's keep this round brief. So I'd like to give a chance to all our panelists. So Professor Crozet, I see you're waiting to make a comment.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Just a remark to explain why there is in France today a conflict between the objective of quality of life and the former cost-benefit analysis. But even if there is a conflict, there is finally the same issue. Because if you look at cost-benefit analysis, you have a lot of different dimensions to take into account. But finally, you have one index with one unidimensional index that is monetary. That is the internal rate of return, for instance. It is the same for the accessibility index. You have a lot of different dimensions to take into account. And finally, you have only one index. And if we look at quality of life, it is the same in the presentation done by Yoshi and the colleagues. You have one index, but into this unidimensional index, you have a lot of different dimensions. And what is clear is that when you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, you have so many goals that finally for the public decision maker, finally one of those goals is probably more important than the others. And what is interesting with the indicator of quality of life is that you can look at finally the hidden main goal of the local decision maker. And clearly in France today, if I look at the local decision makers, the quality of life is related to the reduction of speed. We have to go to slow down, and this is an equivalent the slowdown process is today an equivalent of the quality of life. Even if it's not very smart as an idea, it is clearly the idea of local decision makers.
Great. Mr. Yao, you must be having some reflections based on the comments and also the points that Professor Wickerman and Professor Crozet made after Suzanne's point.
Yeah.
How about your reactions?
Yes, I'm not familiar with the QOL actually, so I would like to have two comments regarding the corona pandemic. First of all, I was in charge of emergency aid related to SARS in China. So I'm supporting the China government recover from the SARS pandemic. And then what I found after the pandemic is that everything recovered very well. You know, people's behavior, people's economic activities is all recovered. That is my findings. And in the case of the corona, I don't know what kind of result we are waiting for, but maybe for me, the biggest impact on the traffic is, the pandemic let the people know to what extent we have to reduce the traffic to avoid the traffic congestion in comparison with each other. So I think after the pandemic, many people will behave by controlling themselves, avoiding the congestions. Maybe that is a very big thing because people knows how to control themselves to avoid the traffic congestions. So maybe it will, related to the topics. That is my comment. Sorry.
That's a very good comment. So before I ask Professor Hayashi, let me ask Professor Rottengatter a 3-minute intervention, please, on what you've heard so far. What are your reactions?
Here we go.
Yeah.
Well, to give my impression on the contributions, I will summarize only some points, some aspects. First, the aspect of, say, more environmentally friendly transport. This is not an illusion. It is not an illusion to increase walking and cycling in city. Look at the Copenhagen example. Copenhagen took 30 years to transform the city system into a bike-friendly system. Now they have 50% of biking, okay, in the intercity transport and only 25% of car traffic. So there was a total transformation through a better infrastructure for bikers and through systematic preference, giving preference and political preference to non-motorized transport. So it is possible. It is not, say, a decision for the long-term future that cities have to, be constructed on the base of motorized transport. This is my first remark. My second remark, yes, the traditional CBA has been based on the welfare concept and not on the base of the GDP concept. But this welfare concept was much too narrow. It concentrated only on the generalized cost, okay, time savings and cost savings. And after that, a little bit of external diseconomies, also evaluated at very narrow approaches for climate change, for instance, for the evaluation of CO2, for the evaluation of accident fatalities, and so on. So it was much too narrow. And therefore, this welfare-based concept had to be extended. And there were several steps for extending this very narrow base. The first was already published before the Marshallian concept was published in 1890. It was a concept of Jules Dupuy, okay, which was published in 1844. It included not a partial market view, okay, as Marshall did it. it included a total market view for all products, okay, which are transported on the project which is under investigation. So, and this is already a step towards wider economic impacts. It's not only the impact on the transport market, it's the impact on all markets for products which are influenced by transportation. And this is a basic difference, okay? And the next step in history was to combine the transportation impacts with economic prosperity. And the first step was done by Friedrich List in Germany. To tell the history, Roger, maybe you know about it. Friedrich List was convinced, okay, that Germany could catch up with the British economy, okay, which was leading at this time, at the 1860, by, say, integrated transport investments, okay, in particular into railways. So the railway system should connect all the regions in the way that the economic, say, prospects could generate growth, which could catch up with the growth in Britain. And so this was the next step. And the third step is now to integrate also quality of life aspects. But before repeating all aspects about quality of life, let me say add one aspect which has been addressed by James Lisa, which is the data requirements for additional analysis of, say, quality of life and all these other things in integrated assessment. Yes, it is true, we need much more data. Yes, it is true, we need more complex models. But one has to make a difference between the modeling part, the scientific part, which is addressing to a sound basis, okay, of the results, and the publication part, okay, which should be very transparent and very simple for the politicians and for people, okay, such that everybody can understand the message. And with respect to the scientific preparation, I'm very much in favor on integrated modeling, okay, and integrating all data which are available and improve on the processing of these data by, say, integrated quantitative modeling. But on the other hand, we have neglected, as scientists, we have neglected that this message has to be transformed. And we can learn from climate research how one can do it. There's very detailed research on the tipping point, okay? Very detailed research on the interconnectivity of all effects. And this is very complex and cannot be understood, okay, by many people and by laymen. But on the other hand, the results can be understood by everybody, that the world temperature is going up and that will cause major impacts. And the same, I think, can be done also with respect to the assessment of transportation systems. It cannot be only an assessment of projects, it has to be an assessment of systems. I agree with James Leather with this respect that the network is important, the configuration of the network is important, and not a single project. And secondly, we have to extend the assessment also to quality of life aspects, although we cannot quantify all of these impacts in monetary terms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Hayashi, you have a difficult challenge. We've actually come to the end of the original time allocated for the entire panel. So I'm going to request you to also speak about the importance of the discussions today for developing countries. We have heard that after the pandemic, developing countries have reported more sales of motor cars because people are afraid to use public transport and they don't have much choice to use non-motorized transport. They have ended up using more cars, which seems good for some auto companies. But what is the scenario for the developing countries? So you have 5 minutes and then we will wrap up today's session.
Thank you very much. I have been very much fascinated by variety of thoughts on evaluation of transport projects. Well, I cannot reflect all the comments, but for Jamie Leather's excellent summaries and views, I was so impressed. From megacity to local, yes, we are applying. So and from mega transport system that is high-speed rail, intercity, long distance, until local street redesigning to be more walkable, or by the sense of Werner, it is bikeable. So, so that is the objectives have changed. That means, okay, so from economy to life, that Jan told. So that is a big paradigm shift we are feeling from 20th century. The 20th century was the people for economy. That's a labor force. But now 21st century is economy for people. So economic enhancement is not bad, but it should be used for people. That is one very big change. And so many interesting things, say combining for developing countries and the post-corona, for both, say, no, it's not seeking for economic growth. That is, now we have recognized, doesn't matter that is developing or developed countries, both. So that means the different paths, different goal, different paths. So Mount Fuji, whether we are climbing directly up or slowly, say following contour lines like this. So variety of set up goals that we should really detailedly discuss, and then the path should be given to different types of people. So far that was fixed, say only road. That is very bad, say in many cases. And the railways only is also too much rigid. So that is the choices. So that's why I was so much concerned to find out a common basis indicator. So I was involved in project assessment of Tokyo Bay Bridge. My doctoral thesis was for that. Okay, so always cost-benefit analysis shows more traffic is welcome and a better project. But I thought it was, why so good? Free driving is much better. Okay, so that is the start of quality of life. So that means, I told economy. So economy is only input to the life. Okay, life is both, so living and the life. But quality of life measure is perceived indicator, perception, showing perception. So that is so very much different. And finally, I wanted to make the system very simple. So which factors, so the external externalities, okay? So Werner told environmental externalities and say quality of life is another externality, or someone else, or Roger told. So which is a denominator and which is a numerator, okay? So finally, it's okay. So all the factors affecting on people's feeling, that is numerator. And then all these factors say influencing on the load on the society or planetary society inclusive is a denominator. Okay, so then we got very simple idea of a factor 4 or 5, Weizsäckers. So now it's very simple. And then although many researchers, the top researchers are against to accept a new system, but I think as Werner or you've told, say origin was, deep origin was welfare. But in the 20th century, we sought for, say, economic growth. That was a welfare we believed because we were poor. But even low income conditions, that will not create happiness, and even under the condition of COVID. So COVID influence, that is transport. Transport is a kind of carriers of virus, okay? So not always good things are transported. So that is a negative transport. So that is also clearly calculated and enumerated. And we have, I think, a lot of data, and many researchers now very, very good. Yeah. Okay, so thank you so much. And we
thank
have
you,
become
Professor
very
Hayashi. We're going to close the session, but before I give it to Professor Rothengatter to really close it with the closing remarks, a last 1 minute response, Professor Wickerman, Professor Crozet, Professor Yao, Mr. Yao, and Professor Zhang. Last 1 minute, any final comment from you? Then I'll request Professor Rothengatter to close it.
Very little I can say in 1 minute to all of that, I think, with that, but I think it does demonstrate the vibrancy of research and our willingness to try and get to grips with some of the real challenges that the world faces in the future. We've been doing it for a long time. I think we've got to continue doing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Koza.
Yes, the same comment. What is clear is that the more you increase the GDP, the more you have some perverse effects. You have very good effects. It's a good thing to have more to increase the GDP, but you have perverse effect. For instance, you increase the purchasing power, and due to that, you increase the scarcity of time for people and a wider use of space. And then you have finally the scarcity of space for the public decision maker, and the scarcity of time. And then the big issue we have to deal with is the fact that we have this double scarcity of time and scarcity of space.
Mr. Yao.
Yeah, I'm from a government, so for me, budget is very limited. So we have to pursue the economic research on the project because bigger budget has a kind of a cap. So, but it is very important to measure many influences from a point of view of QOL. So there are two kinds of maybe evaluation for the project for budget approval, and the other one is a project evaluation for QOL. That's two evaluations are completely different, I think. That is my final comment. Thank you.
Professor Zhang, we have spent almost a year without travel, particularly no international travel. What's your view?
Yes, it's a very terrible time, but I think we have to try to do our best. But my last comment for this very important symposium is that we are scientists, but unfortunately we cannot decide which project can be implemented because politicians, they decide. For example, let's say Dr. Yao, he can decide, but I cannot figure this out. So what we can do for scientists, we try to provide more reliable, more comprehensive, more scientific sound evidence for different indicators. I think quality of life is one of the big, let's say, category for supporting policymaker to make really, let's say, more publicly acceptable policies. So prepare more reliable, let's say, indicator, more less scientific evidence. So that's our role, I think, for scientists.
Thank you. We've really come to the end of the discussion. So let's wrap up. We'll invite Professor Rothengatter. Keep it really very brief, so we'll wrap it up. So Professor Rothengatter, please.
Yes, thank you. So I try to be very brief and not to summarize all contributions which we had today. So first of all, I think we all agree that the traditional concepts of GDP measurement or the traditional neoclassical welfare measurement are not enough. Okay, they have to be extended. That was a clear outcome of the discussion. And the QL approaches is one way, okay, to overcome this traditional thinking, okay, that everything has to do with either GDP growth or with saving time or saving operational cost only. So this is my first remark. Secondly, Yoshi Ayashi, as a father of the recent QL research, has mentioned several times that this QL theory is related to happiness. Okay, he has used the term of happiness sometimes instead of quality of life. And let me come back to that in my final remarks to the happiness. So there are two famous scholars who have contributed to the happiness theory. That are Martin Seligman with the theory of authentic happiness. So he has pointed out that this consists of two components. First of all, a subjective component of feeling fine, okay? And secondly, an objective component that means living a meaningful life, okay? Which is much more long-term orientated. And then Kahneman, who is very well known by economists because he won the Nobel Memorial Prize in 2002 for economics, he emphasized that there's a difference between instant happiness, that having pleasant and enjoying pleasant moments, and secondly, long-term satisfaction. And long-term satisfaction can be measured with objective terms. And that's the approach, I think, of this project, measuring long-term satisfaction and not instantaneous happiness, okay? Long-term satisfaction, which can be increased by the providing of infrastructure for mobility, which people desire, but also by preserving the environment in which people live. And this is, I think, the main message, that it is possible, okay, to construct indicators, quantitative indicators, okay, for this type of measurement of happiness, or better to say, of long-term satisfaction. And that, I think, is the main lessons which we have learned today. It is possible to design systems, okay, which improve on quality of life and meet the needs of people such that no one is left behind. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On that high note of happiness, we are very, very happy that everybody stayed on for really 4 hours of discussion. It's been very rich. And we thank all the speakers, more importantly, all the participants who stayed on for the long 4 hours. And I should not forget to thank